Chapter 387. Looking at Dr. Lin's shocked expression, Yili knew that she had guessed correctly. The imperial tomb of the previous dynasty. Yili's mind quickly flipped through the ancient history books. The previous dynasty had existed for more than 370 years and had experienced 21 emperors. Among them, other than the last emperor who was buried by the Dechu state's ancestor as a noble, the tombs of the other 19 emperors were either destroyed in the chaos of war or looted by tomb robbers. Almost all of them were destroyed. However, there was one emperor whose tomb no one knew the whereabouts of. That was the tomb of the founding emperor of the previous dynasty. Yili suddenly thought of something. The royal family of the previous dynasty seemed to be surnamed Lin. As if sensing Yili's gaze, Dr. Lin looked at her and lightly said, "Don't think too much. I'm not a descendant of the previous dynasty." Then it can't be Lin Yuan, right? If Lin Yuan was looking for the tomb of the previous dynasty's emperor, then it was reasonable to say that it was his tomb. Dr. Lin remained silent. Yili was speechless and looked to the sky. So, she guessed correctly again. Ever since she woke up from her coma, this was the first time Yili felt such a headache. The previous dynasty had been destroyed for more than 200 years. At least in the past few decades, there was no news of any remnants of the previous dynasty wanting to revive the country. But who could say for sure about national enmity and family hatred? Although the Ding Palace wasn't the current ruler, at least half of the previous dynasty's destruction was fought by the first-generation Prince Ding, Mo Lan Yun. Therefore, Yili wasn't sure if those remnants of the previous dynasty hated the Dechu state's emperor more or hated Prince Ding more. And now, she had obviously landed in a place where remnants of the previous dynasty gathered. But what was worth celebrating was that the residents living here, other than a few highly respected people, didn't seem to know about the change of dynasty. They were obviously not interested in who was the emperor. Seeing her holding her chin and her expression changing, Dr. Lin didn't say anything. After all, this kind of thing wasn't something that ordinary people could accept. After a while, Yili finally sorted out the chaotic thoughts in her heart and asked casually, "Master, do you want to restore the country?" "Restore the country?" Dr. Lin looked at her strangely, as if he had eaten something he shouldn't have. After a while, he snorted and said, "Have you seen anyone who hides in the mountains for decades to revive their country? Furthermore, I'm a doctor. How am I supposed to revive the country? Poison Mo Lufang and Mo Jingxian." Yili took a sip of tea and calmly said, "It's Mo Jingqi and Mo Xiuyao. Mo Lufang and Mo Jingxian have already passed away many years ago." Dr. Lin fiercely glared at her and frowned. "This generation's Prince Ding is called Mo Xiuyao? I remember that when Mo Liufang's son was born, he was called Mo Xiuwen." Yili now believed that Dr. Lin really hadn't gone out for decades. She seriously explained, "Mo Xiuwen is the previous generation's Prince Ding. He passed away 9 years ago." Dr. Lin looked at her and said, "You know quite a lot." Yili smiled and said, "Didn't Master say that I was born in a prestigious family? How can I not know such a big thing?" Dr. Lin waved his hand and said irritably, "National enmity and family hatred, it's already been 200 years. Who can say for sure? Furthermore, even if the people are dissatisfied with the Dechu state's royal family, would they still miss the previous dynasty? If that was the case, the previous dynasty wouldn't have been destroyed. At that time, the previous emperors were useless and the people had no way to make a living. Even if the last emperor wanted to reform, he didn't have the talent to be an emperor. In the end, he couldn't turn the tide and could only watch as the country was destroyed. Speaking of which, the Dechu state's ancestors couldn't be blamed. To put it bluntly, the winner was the king and the loser was the bandit. What does Lin Yuan want? Why does Master not want to give it to him? Since Master doesn't care about restoring the country and the matters outside, why? Dr. Lin sighed and looked at her with a bitter smile. "It's not that I don't want to give it to him, but I don't have anything to give him. What he wants, is the treasures of the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's tomb. Yi Li frowned. It was natural for there to be treasures in the emperor's tomb. Yi Li didn't understand what Dr. Lin meant. Dr. Lin said indifferently, Emperor Gaozu's tomb is indeed here. The people in this village are the descendants of the most loyal guards who followed Emperor Gaozu. After Emperor Gaozu passed away, these people swore to guard the tomb for Emperor Gaozu forever. In order to prevent the younger generation from being unfilial, they also set a rule that the younger generation can't learn to read. They can't step out of the tomb and can't leave the village. Moreover, the secret of the tomb is only passed down from generation to generation. Even the villagers don't know where they came from. Yi Li didn't know how to evaluate this, so she didn't say anything. She raised her head and asked, what does Master plan to do now? If he finds out that this subordinate didn't bring the things back, will Lin Yuan come back personally? Dr. Lin nodded and thought for a bit before asking Yi Li, now, the world is unstable. If the Dechu state was peaceful and there was no hope of restoring the country, Lin Yuan wouldn't think about the tomb. Yi Li didn't hide it and nodded, it is indeed a bit chaotic. If nothing unexpected happens, the Mahist army and the Dechu state's royal family are likely to break off relations. Dr. Lin sighed and leisurely said, in the past, it was said that the Dechu state's Taizu and the founding Prince Ding had deep brotherly love and were very powerful when they joined hands to fight for the throne. I didn't think that these two families would also break off relations. No wonder, forget it, this old man can't care about these things. Girl, pack up and we'll leave here as soon as possible. Yi Li couldn't help being surprised, if we leave, what about the villagers? Dr. Lin snorted and said, I'll naturally leave a message for him. It's best if he doesn't make a move against these people. Yi Li raised her eyebrows, he'll listen to you. Dr. Lin sneered, if he doesn't, then I'll give the item to Mo Xiuyao. Yi Li was silent. She admired this cheap master of hers. You don't even know if there are any treasures in the imperial mausoleum or what kind of treasures there are, yet you dare to lead this matter to Mo Xiuyao. Do you want Mo Xiuyao to die, or do you want Lin Yuan to die? Master, why don't you find someone else? How about Shiling's Genom of Gojoseon and Lei Jinting? Yi Li advised sincerely. Looking at Dr. Lin's appearance, it was clear that he still had some feelings for Lin Yuan. Yi Li still didn't want him to go against Mo Xiuyao. She didn't want to hurt the relationship between master and disciple. Dr. Lin glanced at her and narrowed his eyes suspiciously, girl, how are you related to Mo Xiuyao? I seem to have heard those two fellows say that Mo Xiuyao is near Hangzhou. What a coincidence, you. Yi Li smiled faintly, Master, who I am is not important right now. What do you think? You just need to know that your disciple will never do anything to harm you. Dr. Lin stared at her for a long time. Yi Li didn't move. She sat there calmly and allowed him to look at her. After a while, Dr. Lin snorted softly and nodded, changing the topic. It wasn't easy to leave such a secluded mountain village. Especially when the people who were about to leave were an old man in his 60s who didn't know any martial arts and a pregnant woman. What was worse was that the path they were going to take was the Imperial Mausoleum, which no one had ever been to before. Because they were an old man and a pregnant woman, there was no need for them to imagine that they would be able to walk out of the dangerous mountain range. Moreover, it was very likely that they would encounter Lin Yuan or the people sent by Lin Yuan on the way. Therefore, the path that was said to exist in the Imperial Mausoleum was their only hope. Chapter 388. Yi Li couldn't help but think of some tomb-raiding novels she had read in her previous life. She hoped that this Imperial Mausoleum wasn't as dangerous and strange as those books said, otherwise. If she had a choice, Yi Li would rather wait for the baby to be born before leaving through the safe route. But now, no one knew his identity. Once that person called Lin Yuan appeared, it would be different. If he really had the ambition to restore the country, then he would definitely be able to guess that she was Mo Xiuyao's wife, the mistress of the Ding kingdom. When that time came, there would be big trouble. A few days later, Dr. Lin finally finished packing up all of his things, including his ancient books and unique books. Yili also took advantage of this period of time to prepare some things that she needed. Then, in the morning, when everyone in the village was still asleep, the old patriarch of the village personally sent them to the mountains. He was already over 70 years old, but he was still waiting for them. Sure enough, it was the waterfall that Yili had observed before. The old clan head brought the two of them into the waterfall. Inside, there was a huge karst cave. Yili was already prepared. She took off the bamboo hat on her back and shook off the water on it. When she took out the bamboo hat and draped it over her body, the old clan head and Dr. Lin looked at her in surprise. Yili smiled sweetly. "Isn't this for the baby, just in case?" Dr. Lin looked at her meaningfully and didn't say anything. The white-haired old clan head looked at the two of them and didn't say anything. It was obvious that Dr. Lin had already negotiated with him before. He brought the two of them into the karst cave. This karst cave was big and deep. It was obviously a natural karst cave. There were different shapes of stalagmites hanging from the ceiling and water droplets dripped down from time to time. In the middle was a fast-flowing man-made river. Not only was the river neat and beautiful, even the roads on both sides were carefully carved out of stone. Although it was covered with moss because no one had walked on it for many years, one could still see the exquisite patterns on the stone base if one looked carefully. Yili couldn't help but twitch her mouth. It was said that every emperor had to build their own imperial mausoleum as soon as they ascended the throne. If they were all on the same scale as the previous dynasty's Gaozu, then they really needed to start building it as soon as they ascended the throne. Even a place that had nothing to do with the imperial mausoleum was built like this. If they didn't start building it earlier, then they might not even have a place to bury their dead. The three of them walked along the karst cave. After walking for about an hour, they finally stopped. They had already reached the end. They could only see a torrent of water emerging from the bottom of the stone wall. Yili could only hope that the current situation did not require them to dive into the water. The old patriarch slowly groped around the stone walls that were covered with moss and all kinds of weeds. After a while, he finally found a place. He then took out a strangely shaped key and pressed it on the stone wall to turn it. After a while, with a bang, a door opened in the stone wall. The old patriarch looked at the two of them and said, "You can go in. Take care of yourself." Dr. Lin nodded and said, "You." The old patriarch raised his hand to stop him and nodded, "I know. We have been guarding this place for hundreds of years. No one has ever entered. After so many years, we don't want to know what is inside. Since the great ancestor didn't leave the things inside to the future generations, we don't want to change now. I am old. I only hope that this village will be an ordinary village in the future. I don't need to guard anything anymore. This secret ends here with me. This old man thanks you for not revealing this secret to the young master all these years. After you go in, there is no need for this. Take it with you." Dr. Lin nodded and said, "Take care." After taking the key from the old patriarch, Dr. Lin took Yili and walked in. The stone wall slowly closed in front of the two of them. When the stone wall closed, the two of them saw darkness. Dr. Lin lit a match and walked to the oil lamp on the stone wall. Soon, the candlelight on the stone wall shone on the bronze mirror diagonally opposite. Then, the light refracted and shone on another bronze mirror. In a moment, the originally thin and dark passage became bright. Yili raised her eyebrows and followed Dr. Lin without saying a word. The passage was quiet. Only the sound of the two people's footsteps could be heard. Yili observed the walls on both sides as she walked. She had to say that the former Emperor Gaozu was indeed rich and imposing. As the princess consort of Dingwa, Yili had participated in the imperial mausoleum sacrificial ceremony once or twice. She had also entered the former emperor's underground palace. Although she was only at the outermost part, she had never seen such an inconspicuous passage carved out of marble. The dragon-shaped reliefs on the walls and on the ground were lifelike. The eyes of each dragon were inlaid with various colored gems. The rich and domineering aura of the emperor and the royal family rushed out. The two of them walked along the passage and did not encounter any of the legendary traps. In this kind of imperial mausoleum that did not see the light of day, Yili could only estimate the direction and distance they were walking. After an hour, they finally arrived at a side room. The oil lamp in the hall suddenly filled the room with a fragrance. Yili cautiously took a few steps back to stay away from the oil lamp. However, she quickly reacted. This fragrance was not poison. It was ambergris. However, it was still not good for pregnant women. Yili should stay away from it as much as possible. Dr. Lin lowered his head to look at the shabby map in his hand as he looked at the empty room. Rest first. You are tired. Yili looked at the map in his hand and asked curiously, since the old clan leader does not want the treasures in the imperial mausoleum to see the light of day, isn't he afraid that we will come back and take the treasures away? Dr. Lin turned to look at her and calmly said, it is said that, the entrance we entered the imperial mausoleum cannot be opened without a key. And the exit we are going to leave, can only be opened once. Each time, it can only be opened for 15 minutes. Yili could not help but sweat. Master, are you sure that the exit has not been opened by anyone? The term, master, clearly made the old man's mood better. His expression relaxed and he said, if it has been opened, what will you do? Yili smiled and helplessly said, then I can only accompany you in life and death. But my poor baby. Dr. Lin could not help but smile. He looked at her and said, this child is very lucky. He has been with you for so long and is still alive. Nothing will happen to him. Thank you for your kind words. Yili said with a smile. Yili relaxed a little. Still confused, she asked, what did the founding emperor of the previous dynasty leave in the imperial mausoleum? And why did the old clan leader not want Lin Yuan to take it? Dr. Lin calmly said, I don't know. But the great ancestor had ordered the guards to not spread the treasures. As for the old clan leader, they just want to live well. Yili raised her eyebrows. Dr. Lin said, Lin Yuan grew up in the village. The old clan leader naturally knows his nature. If he does not take the treasures, then it will be fine. But if he does, then no one in the village will be able to live. Yili was puzzled. Dr. Lin waved his hand to show that he had no intention of saying more. Yili found a place to sit down. She gently stroked her belly and comforted the baby. Then she lowered her head to study the carvings on the stone wall. The empty stone room was quiet. Only the sound of Yili's finger tapping on the stone wall could be heard. Chapter 389. Even if Lin Yuan had obtained the treasures in the tomb, there was no need for him to kill everyone in the village to silence them. Because these people were the descendants of the Gaozu's loyal subjects from hundreds of years ago. What was even stranger was that Lin Yuan, as a descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family, didn't know the secret of the tomb. Instead, Dr. Lin, the one who raised him, knew. Of course, if it was explained by Lin Yuan's young age, it would make sense. But, if Dr. Lin didn't want him to have thoughts of reviving the country, he could have kept his identity a secret. When Lin Yuan first came to this village, he was only 1 year old. There was no way he could remember anything. Looking up at Dr. Lin, who was sitting in a daze, Yili raised her eyebrows. This Lin Yuan. She felt that something was wrong. And that Emperor Gaozu's treasure, it didn't seem to be a normal treasure like gold and silver or antiques. It also didn't seem to be a secret military manual or a legendary treasure like a sword or a sword. Then, what exactly was it? Yili looked regretfully at her belly. If it weren't for the inconvenience of having a baby, she wouldn't have minded exploring the treasures and secrets of the previous dynasty's founding emperor. After resting enough, the two got up and followed the route shown on the map. Regardless of whether the tomb was dangerous or not, the feeling of being in this enclosed space was not pleasant. Along the way, Yili habitually memorized the route they took. As a former Special Forces soldier, a good sense of direction was a must. At least, no matter where she was, she never had to worry about getting lost. The two silently walked forward. Yili looked at the increasingly luxurious decorations and frowned slightly. She casually asked, "Master, are we going the wrong way?" Dr. Lin looked down at the map in his hand and turned to look at her. "Oh. What do you mean?" Yili frowned and said, "We seem to be walking towards the middle of the Imperial Mausoleum, which is opposite of the exit." Even if the Imperial Mausoleum did not give a straight path, it was impossible for it to be completely opposite, right? Even if the Earth was round, the tomb didn't cover the entire Earth. Dr. Lin looked at her and said, "Who said we were in Hangzhou?" Yili was speechless as she looked at Dr. Lin. Even if he wasn't in Hangzhou, he couldn't be in the center of the mausoleum, right? Being stared at by Yili like this, Dr. Lin felt a little uncomfortable, so he said, "All right, I have to go and get something before I can go out. If you don't want to go, you can wait for me here, or you can take a look at this map and make a copy of it before leaving." Yili breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. At least this proved that this cheap master had no intention of harming her. Otherwise, although she was confident that she could restrain him, it was hard to say what she would encounter in the Imperial Mausoleum that had existed for hundreds of years. After thinking about it, Yili hesitated for a moment before asking, "Lin Yuan, is there any other way to get in?" Dr. Lin clearly didn't want to give the item to Lin Yuan, so he wanted to take it away. Dr. Lin was silent, but Yili understood from his expression. As expected, the saying that there was only one exit was never reliable. For example, it was said that the ancient craftsmen who built the Imperial Mausoleum would leave a secret passage for themselves to prevent the royal family from silencing them. Shrugging her shoulders, Yili smiled and said, "I'll go with Master. What if I get lost and can't get out?" "You should think carefully. From what I know, this Imperial Mausoleum isn't dangerous. You can wait for me at the exit. If I don't come in 2 days, you can open the mechanism and leave." Yili looked around and said, "I didn't know if this place was dangerous or not, but now it might not be. I'm a girl and walking alone in the Imperial Mausoleum is always a little scary. Following Master will give me some courage." Dr. Lin looked deeply at her and sighed. He turned around and walked forward. "I don't know why you insist on following me. If you get involved, don't blame this old man." Yili smiled and walked 2 steps forward, "Because you're my master. I know you're a good person." Dr. Lin snorted. "I'm not a good person. Don't pretend to be ignorant in front of me. This old man has seen a lot of people in his life, but there are only a few that I can't see through." Yili pretended not to notice his sarcasm and blinked her eyes. "Master, are you praising me?" The master and disciple walked and stopped. Because they had to take care of Yili's health and Dr. Lin was not young, they didn't walk very fast. There was no light in the Imperial Mausoleum, so Yili could only estimate the time. After they entered the Imperial Mausoleum, they walked and stopped for 6 to 8 hours. They then rested in a stone room for a few hours. They had spent more than a day in there. But the two of them had only just reached the entrance of the Imperial Mausoleum. Standing in front of a majestic palace door, Dr. Lin turned to Yili and said, "Be careful when you go in. Don't touch anything you shouldn't touch. If you trigger any traps, don't blame me for not warning you." Yili looked at him. "Master clearly said that there wasn't any danger in here." Dr. Lin snorted and a proud expression appeared on his face. "Of course there isn't any danger if you follow me. If you follow someone else, then it might not be so. Previously, when we were outside the Imperial Mausoleum, it was just a smokescreen. There are at least 5 times more traps inside than outside." Yili wiped the non-existent sweat from her forehead, Master, your disciple feels like we've fallen into a trap. What would have happened if I hadn't come in with you? Dr. Lin's lips twitched without a trace of a smile. The traps at the exit aren't any less than inside. Also, the map to decipher the traps is placed together with the treasure. You know so well, Yili muttered in a low voice. The mausoleum was silent, so Dr. Lin naturally heard Yili's voice clearly. He smiled proudly and said, "This mausoleum was designed and built by our ancestors. Do you think there's anyone in this world who knows it better than me?" Yili raised her eyebrows and followed closely behind Dr. Lin. After entering the Imperial Mausoleum, Yili finally understood what an Imperial Mausoleum was. No one knew what the inside of Emperor Qin's mausoleum was like. In her previous life, Yili had seen many imperial mausoleums that had been plundered or excavated by grave robbers. They could only be considered historical remains. Yili remembered that the historical records had once recorded the Emperor Qin's mausoleum. Through the 3 springs, copper was poured into the coffin. The palace was filled with hundreds of officials, strange objects. Mercury was used as the rivers and the seas, and the mechanics were imbued. Astronomy above, geography below. Mermaid paste was used as a candle to help those who were not extinguished for a long time. She didn't know if this mausoleum was as grand and magnificent as the Emperor Qin's mausoleum, but the scene in front of her was enough to prove that it was at least comparable to the Emperor Qin's mausoleum. The marble floor and walls were exquisitely carved, and lines of mercury and stars were densely packed in the astonishingly large mausoleum. She raised her head to look at the stars in the sky, which were all illuminated by various luminous pearls. The funerary objects in the mausoleum weren't bronze objects, but all kinds of exquisite gold, jade, and precious stones. The mausoleum was surrounded by lamps. In addition to the countless treasures in the mausoleum, the entire mausoleum was as bright as day. Looking at the dazzling mausoleum in front of her, which looked just like a miniature version of the imperial city, Yili couldn't help but pay attention to the few short sentences in the historical records. Were ancient imperial mausoleums so similar regardless of time and space? Chapter 390. There shouldn't be terracotta soldiers near the Imperial Mausoleum, right? Yili softly muttered. She carefully followed Dr. Lin forward. Even though everything in front of her was a rare treasure, she had no intention of touching it. Dr. Lin turned around to look at her. "How do you know there are terracotta soldiers?" Yili was shocked. "There really are. Could this previous dynasty's great ancestor be the reincarnation of Qin Shi Huang?" Yili shook her head to get rid of the wild thoughts in her mind. The Qin Shi Huang swept through the 6 directions. Although the previous dynasty's great ancestor's martial arts were peerless, he was still lacking. Dr. Lin looked at her and then turned around to continue walking. He said, "According to the ancestors' records, there really were terracotta soldiers. But at that time, the world had just settled down and there was no way to spend such a large amount of money to build an imperial mausoleum. So in the end, 2/3 of the great ancestors' plan was cut off. The terracotta soldiers were only mentioned in a few secret records about the great ancestor." Yili sighed. This scale was only 1/3. If he really built the entire imperial mausoleum, the previous dynasty might have died 100 or 2 years earlier. Actually, this is not bad. If the future generations have any difficulties, they can just tear down the imperial mausoleum. It's enough. Yili said with a faint smile. Dr. Lin's cold snort came from the front. Even the most unfilial of descendants would not tear down their ancestors' tombs. Yili blinked. Then what's the point of hiding so much gold and silver here? Of course she knew this reasoning. People who had never been emperors would never understand the meaning of building an imperial mausoleum like this. With so much money, it would be better to leave it for the future generations to deal with emergencies. They did not speak along the way. Even with Dr. Lin leading the way, the two of them carefully went around several mechanisms before approaching a palace-like building in the center of the imperial mausoleum. Yili understood that this was the place where the tomb owner's coffin was placed. This was a building completely carved out of white jade. It stood at the end of the imperial mausoleum. Even from far away, this kind of snow-white palace could be seen. When they got closer, they looked at the exquisitely carved window lattice hall. Dragons sat on the eaves, and below the eaves hung lifelike flowers and plants carved out of jade. Dragons and phoenixes were carved on the steps of the palace. Most importantly, there was a huge white dragon coiling around this white palace. The dragon's head was on the roof of the palace, and a pair of huge eyes made of luminous pearls was glaring angrily at the visitors. For some reason, Yili couldn't help but twitch her lips when she saw this luxurious, and domineering palace. An extremely strange feeling arose in her heart. However, when she saw Dr. Lin's excited and admiring expression, Yili decided not to say anything. "Master, do you want to go in?" Yili couldn't help but ask. Dr. Lin came back to his senses and put away the expression on his face. He reluctantly looked at the white building in front of him and nodded. The two of them stood at the entrance of the palace in a daze. The gate of the palace was shut tight, there was no lock or anything else. There was only a piece of black jade engraved with words, surrounded by coiling dragons. The two of them looked at it carefully. There were a few simple words arranged without any pattern, but these words were moving. It was clear that they needed someone to rearrange them. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at the words in front of her: Sweep, He, Lu, Jun, Xia, Heng, Lin, Tian. It was a very simple 8-character game. When put together, it should be Sweep 6, Lord descends under the heavens. Seeing Dr. Lin move the words on the door, Yili frowned slightly. She didn't know why, but she felt a sense of unease. However, after looking at it carefully for a long time, she still couldn't figure out what the problem was. Yili could only stand to the side and carefully look at Dr. Lin. Suddenly, Yili seemed to see the words on the side of the door twist strangely. Yili blinked, trying to determine if she was hallucinating or if she really saw something. She carefully looked at the word Tian and finally found that the bottom part of the word Tian was a little crooked for some reason. Moreover, if she looked carefully, she would find that something was slowly squirming. Yili's mind raced. Something quickly flashed through her mind. She didn't have time to think carefully. She stretched out her hand and pulled Dr. Lin, who was lowering his head and moving the words, away. "Aya!" Dr. Lin cried out in alarm. He didn't need Yili to pull him back. He looked at his fingers in shock. 2 of his fingers were stuck with some strange black things that were slowly squirming. His fingers were also being corroded at an extremely fast speed. Dr. Lin's expression changed greatly. Yili didn't have time to think carefully. She grabbed Dr. Lin's hand and slashed the sharp dagger in her hand. The skin and part of the corroded flesh on Dr. Lin's 2 fingers were cut off and fell to the ground. Then, the 2 of them were shocked to find that the rotten flesh on the ground was actually continuing to corrode the white jade foundation on the ground. They both turned to look at the door. The image on the door was gradually becoming blurry. More and more black things were squirming on it, as if they were about to break free. Yili pulled Dr. Lin back 2 steps and said, "Master, we're in big trouble. Let's go." Dr. Lin looked at his right hand that was still bleeding. His expression was very ugly. The secret ancestral records didn't mention this. Yili said, "It's clear that the ancestor of the previous dynasty tricked you. What is that thing?" The 2 of them quickly walked down the steps of the palace. But it was clear that the owner of the tomb didn't plan on letting the intruders off so easily. The piers that were originally built on the surface of the Mercury River for people to cross suddenly sank to the bottom of the water. Yili even heard cracking sounds in many places. It was clearly the sound of some mechanisms being activated. Not to mention that none of them could jump over the Mercury River. Even if they could, the following mechanisms and hidden weapons wouldn't be easy to deal with. The designer of the tomb definitely wouldn't have not considered the possibility that the intruders could be a martial arts expert. The two of them turned back to look at the door. The black things were already beginning to grow bigger. The writing from before couldn't be seen at all. Some of them had already separated from the body and were flying out like small insects. The two of them had seen the power of those small insects. Dr. Lin only touched a little bit and two of his fingers were corroded. There was also a hole the size of a wine cup in the white jade foundation. If they touched their bodies, not only would the two of them die, they would die very miserably. What is this thing? Dr. Lin frowned. Although his family was no longer involved in matters related to tombs, there were still many records in the family. But he was certain that he had never seen this kind of thing before. Yili pulled Dr. Lin. While looking for a place to retreat, she vigilantly stared at the black fog not far away. Master knows about awe-inspiring caterpillar fungus, right? Dr. Lin didn't understand. Awe-inspiring caterpillar fungus? What does this have to do with awe-inspiring caterpillar fungus? Yili said, it's a worm in the winter and a grass in the summer. This is the same. When it's warm, it's a worm. When it's cold, it's like jade. When Master moved the words, the temperature of his fingers made these small things come alive. Does Master have a way? Dr. Lin was helpless. I've never even seen this damn thing before. What can I do? Yili said, then it's troublesome. If these small things fly everywhere, not only will we be unlucky, but all the treasures in this tomb will also suffer. Chapter 391. Do you still have time to think about these things right now? Dr. Lin glared at her and said in a bad mood. Yili said with a faint smile, just because I don't think about it doesn't mean other people won't. Dr. Lin was stunned. What other people? As soon as his voice fell, a black shadow flew up from the other side. There were several whooshing sounds as several sharp arrows flew towards the black shadow in the air. The black-clothed person jumped into the air and narrowly dodged the arrows in the air. A row of giant nails came down from above his head. The black-clothed person who didn't have time to land in the air could only flip around and dodged the nails with difficulty. There was a tearing sound as his clothes were torn a little. Only then did she see the black-clothed person land in a sorry state. He swayed on the ground before steadying himself. Yili's hand was like lightning and the dagger in her hand flashed with a cold light. The black-clothed person had just steadied himself when the cold dagger was pressed against his back. Don't move. If I was too heavy, I might not take your life, but I'm afraid you will be bedridden for the rest of your life. The black-clothed person slightly tilted his head. Princess Ding. So you're still alive? Yili smiled, so it's an acquaintance? But, there doesn't seem to be anyone like you among the people this Fei knows? The man raised his hand and threw the weapon in his hand to the ground, saying, Wang Fei, don't be nervous. I won't hurt you and I definitely won't let you die. At least, I definitely won't let you die here. Yili gave a beautiful smile. I am very moved. But before you come, you should first tell me who you are. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that you won't die here. Saying this, Yili held the dagger in one hand and the man in the other. She turned him to face Dr. Lin and asked with a smile, Master, do you know him? Dr. Lin looked at the black-clothed man with a complicated expression. After a long time, he gave a long sigh and said, You still came in the end. The man said matter-of-factly, I just came to take back what belongs to me. What's wrong with that? Yili tilted her head to look at the two people. She smiled and said, I'm more and more curious about who you are. The man smiled and said, Why don't you come to the front and take a look yourself? The tomb was quiet. Yili glanced over the shoulder of the man in black and saw Dr. Lin standing opposite her with a tense expression. After a moment of silence, she suddenly chuckled and took the initiative to let go of the dagger against the man in black and took a few steps back. Seeing Dr. Lin's surprised expression, Yili smiled and said, It's just a joke. Now that we're in the same boat, if we make a fuss, we might not be able to leave. The black-clothed man adjusted himself slightly, lowered his head and laughed softly. He said in a deep voice, "Everyone says that Princess Ding is extremely intelligent, but I didn't believe it at first. But now it seems that the rumors are true. No wonder Prince Ding is willing to." At the mention of Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li's heart tightened. She hadn't heard any news about Mo Xiaoyao in a long time. Thinking about his health and the environment he was in, she couldn't help but worry. But at this time, she would not reveal any of her thoughts in front of this man who she didn't know anything about. She looked calmly at the man in black whose back was facing her and said coolly, "It seems that this Fei and sire know each other. Since this is the case, why don't we meet in person?" The black-clothed man didn't say much and turned to face Yi Li. According to Yi Li's understanding, Lin Yuan should be in his early 30s, but the man in front of her looked no more than 26 or 27. The black robes made his figure appear even thinner and taller. At the same time, it made his handsome face appear even more sinister and cold. It was just a glance, but it gave people a very uncomfortable feeling. Yi Li frowned slightly. Looking at Yi Li's expression, the man did not mind. His gaze stopped at Yi Li's stomach that was not small anymore. He smiled and said, "This one greets Princess Ding." Yi Li stared at him for a beat before calmly calling out his name, "Tan Ji. Ji." The black-clothed man looked at Yi Li. His sinister smile seemed to become more joyful. "I hadn't thought that Wang Fei would remember such a small person like this one. This one is really fortunate. This one is Tan Ji. Wang Fei can call me Lin Yuan." Yi Li snorted softly and said faintly, "Tan Darren, now does not seem to be the time to reminisce. If you don't think of a way, you and I can sleep here forever." Towards Yi Li's clear disdain, Tan Ji did not care. He said calmly, "Wang Fei is right." Finishing, he turned to look at the growing black mist at the door. They could only rejoice that these things seemed to like to gather together and not fly around by themselves. Otherwise, they would be in even greater trouble. Tan Ji turned his head to look at Yi Li and asked, "Since Wang Fei has some understanding of these things, do you have a way to deal with them?" Yi Li also understood that this was not the time to bargain. She said faintly, "These things become insects when they are hot and jade when they are cold. Tan Darren does not need this Fei to say more, right?" Tan Ji rubbed his chin and said in a low voice, "Cold. I understand. Wang Fei, please wait a moment." Finishing, Tan Ji rose into the air again and flew towards the other side. It was clear that he wanted to find something. At the same time, he was met with an endless barrage of hidden weapons and sharp arrows. Fortunately, Tan Ji seemed to have a good understanding of this tomb. Even though he was in a sorry state, he was not injured. With a few leaps, he disappeared into the palace and jewels on the other side. Yi Li pulled Dr. Lin further away. Dr. Lin looked and stopped her from leading the way. The inside of the tomb was not as safe as the tomb passageways they had walked through before. There were many mechanisms and traps that normal people could not see. When there was no place to retreat, Dr. Lin stopped and turned his head to look at Yi Li. He said, "You are this generation's Prince Ding's Wang Fei?" Yi Li smiled apologetically. "Yes, I have concealed it from Master. I hope you do not blame me. My surname is Yi and my given name is Li." Dr. Lin snorted softly. "What you are called has nothing to do with me. How do you know Lin Yuan?" Yi Li's eyebrows rose slightly. "I have met Tan Darren once. He is the advisor of the Dechu State's Emperor's Imperial Study. He is a true confidant. Speaking of which, for me to appear here, it might have something to do with Tan Darren." Dr. Lin frowned and said in deep thought, "The Dechu State's Emperor and the Prince Ding mansion had a falling out?" Yi Li shrugged and did not answer. Even if they had not fallen out on the surface, it was probably close. However, she did not know how much effort Tan Ji had put into this. There were so many civil and military officials in the imperial court, but they were all fooled by this person. There was no lack of martial arts experts in the imperial court, but everyone treated this person as a weak scholar. Even someone as suspicious as Mo Jingqi did not suspect him in the slightest. It could be seen that this person's methods were truly exceptional. Dr. Lin looked at Yi Li and asked curiously, since that is the case, why do I not see you at all worried about your own safety? Yi Li covered her mouth and smiled. Master, forgive me for saying something disrespectful. In this ancient tomb, even if Tan Darren abandons you, he would not abandon me. As long as there is a glimmer of hope, he would want to bring me out alive. The value of a living Princess Ding and the future heir could not be compared to a corpse. Perhaps she and her child Tan Jiji could be used to threaten Mo Xiaoyao and the Mahist army. He could even negotiate with Mo Xiaoyao. If it was only a corpse, Tan Jiji might not dare to send it to Mo Xiaoyao because it would only anger Mo Xiaoyao. Chapter 392. Dr. Lin lowered his head, silently agreeing with Yi Li's words. He had raised Lin Yuan until he was nearly 20 years old, so he naturally understood his thoughts. In Lin Yuan's eyes, his adoptive father might not be as valuable as Yi Li, the Ding Guo Wangfei. While the two were talking, Tan Jiji had already returned. His qinggong was obviously not bad, at least after dodging more than 10 waves of hidden weapons and arrows, he was still able to move with ease. He glanced at Yi Li standing in the corner by the Quicksilver River. He no longer hesitated and rushed towards the black fog that was about to enter space and time. Huh? What is that? Yi Li looked in the distance with some surprise. A thick layer of white ice crystals wrapped around the black fog. Although it still tried to struggle, Tan Jiji held a bag of water in his hand and kept pouring it on the ice crystals, making the white ice crystals thicker and thicker. Gradually, the black fog was completely wrapped inside. Dr. Lin's face was a little ugly. He coldly said, "Snow Jade Pearl." Yi Li was at a loss. When she was young, under the guidance of the Su family and the Su family, she had a certain foundation in appraising treasures and antiques. But she had never heard of this Snow Jade Pearl. Dr. Lin coldly said, its other name is Corpse-Raising Pearl. As long as it is placed in the mouth of the deceased will quickly be wrapped in a layer of ice crystals and will not rot for 100 years. He moved the bodies of the concubines who were buried with him. Yi Li uncomfortably rubbed her cheeks. She smiled apologetically to Dr. Lin and said, "Master, this is an urgent matter. This tomb was at least 500 years old. Something taken out from the mouth of a 500-year-old corpse." Even Yi Li's smile was a little stiff. However, if that was the only way to solve the current situation, Yi Li could only apologize to the concubines who were buried with him. After all, no one knew what the black fog would become in the end. Looking at the constantly expanding appearance, Yi Li did not doubt that it would completely corrode half of the tomb, including them who could not escape. Seeing that the other side was almost finished, the two walked back. Tan Jiji looked at the two with a smile and said to Dr. Lin, "Father, all the mechanisms in the tomb have been activated. If we want to get out of here safely, we have to solve all the puzzles and treasures left behind by our ancestors." Dr. Lin said with a cold face, "Young master, this old man doesn't deserve to be called father. I also don't know about any riddles or treasures. Since young master is the owner of the Imperial Mausoleum, you can do whatever you want." Tan Jiji's face darkened slightly as he said indifferently, "Father, why do you have to be angry with me? What I've done has always been the wishes of our ancestors, hasn't it? It's fine if father doesn't support me, but why does he keep making things difficult for me?" Dr. Lin's face twisted as he turned around and stopped talking. Tan Jiji didn't care. He looked sideways at Yi Li and said with a smile, "Wang Fei, this tomb is full of traps. Can this one believe that Wang Fei won't make trouble?" Yi Li gently stroked her belly and smiled gently, "Official Tan can rest assured. Even if this consort doesn't care about her own life, she still has to take care of the child in her belly." Tan Jiji nodded with satisfaction and said, "Very good. This one also doesn't want to hurt Wang Fei and the little heir." I also don't want to become enemies with His Highness Prince Ding. After receiving Yi Li's promise, Tan Jiji didn't have to worry about anything else. He walked forward and bent over to examine the palace's large door. The black insect fog from before had caused quite a bit of damage to the white jade door. The originally snow-white door was now covered with black spots and holes. Yi Li looked at the ice crystal ball that had rolled to the side. There was still a black jade-like object that could be seen clearly. The puzzle on the door was still there. Under the strange black jade, there was another layer of jasper. This time, Tan Jiji had clearly learned his lesson from Dr. Lin. He didn't use his finger to touch the surface of the jasper. Instead, he took out a dagger and slowly moved the words on the surface. The puzzle of 8 words wasn't difficult to begin with. After a short while, Tan Jiji finished it. With 2 cracking sounds, the jasper split in 2 and fell to the ground. What was revealed was a strange keyhole. The white jade door didn't have a lock. It was just a round keyhole. Tan Jiji turned to look at Dr. Lin and said, "Father, please give me the key." Dr. Lin calmly and indifferently looked at him. "I don't have the key." Tan Jiji frowned. His malicious face clearly showed his displeasure. Of course, he didn't believe that Dr. Lin didn't have the key. If one asked who in this world knew the most about this tomb other than himself, then it would undoubtedly be his foster father who had raised him since he was young. Because everything he knew had been told to him by his foster father since he was young. "Perhaps I can try." Seeing Tan Jiji's increasingly gloomy face, Yi Li suddenly spoke. The 2 people facing each other were stunned. They both looked at Yi Li. Tan Jiji's gaze was filled with surprise and suspicion. Dr. Lin's gaze was filled with doubt and worry. Yi Li slowly walked forward. She lowered her head to observe the keyhole for a while. She lowered her head and laughed. Picking locks was once a necessary skill. Not to mention the previous one. Yi Li suddenly felt a little curious about the founding ancestor of the previous dynasty. She raised her hand and took out a simple copper hairpin from her hair. Yi Li casually fiddled with the keyhole. The 2 people behind her looked at the woman in front of them with a strange expression. If Princess Ding's knowledge of civil and martial arts didn't count as anything, then the fact that she could pick locks was very strange. Looking at her familiar appearance, Tan Jiji felt that even if there were many godly thieves in the Jianghu, they wouldn't be as good as the woman in front of him. At least, in order to enter this tomb, he had specially studied many mechanisms and locks. However, the one in front of him clearly made him confused. After about 15 minutes, there was a "kacha" sound from inside. Yi Li pulled out the copper hairpin and took a step back. The white jade door made a "ka-ka" sound. A moment later, under the gaze of the 3 people, it slowly retreated to the side. The center of the imperial tomb was revealed in front of the 3 people. Inside was a grand hall. It was clearly built to imitate the main hall of the imperial palace. The altar lamp in the hall was still quietly burning. The grand hall was dazzling with gold and jade. It made people feel as if they were truly in an imperial palace and not in a gloomy ancient tomb. His gaze swept around the hall, but he didn't see the coffin of the previous dynasty's ancestor, which he originally thought should be in the hall. There was only a sandalwood box on the imperial table in the hall, and a portrait of the emperor in court robes hung in front of it. It was clearly the founding ancestor of the previous dynasty. Tan Jiji was stunned. He couldn't help but kneel in front of the portrait and respectfully kowtow a few times. Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked at Dr. Lin, who had a deep frown. He clearly didn't have any intention of kneeling to the previous emperor. After Tan Jiji finished kneeling to the ancestor, he stood up. He looked at Yi Li and said, "Princess Ding, this is my ancestor, the founding ancestor of the previous dynasty." His words were filled with admiration and yearning for his ancestor. His tone towards Yi Li also contained a bit of flaunting and self-satisfaction. Yi Li gave him face and nodded. She smiled and said, "Congratulations, I've heard a lot about you." Tan Jiji clearly didn't care about her perfunctory words. He quickly walked into the hall and stared in a daze at the large sandalwood box on the imperial table. He carefully held his breath. Clearly, this was the treasure he had been searching for. Yi Li stared at the sandalwood box with great interest. She was really curious about what kind of treasure could compare to the mountains of gold, silver, jewels, jade, and antiques outside. Chapter 393. Tan Jiji looked at her and smiled. Princess is also interested. Why don't you come up and uncover the secret of this treasure with this one? Seeing Tan Jiji's expression that seemed to be bestowing a gift, Yi Li pulled up the corners of her lips and smiled. No need, Tan Darren, please do as you please. Yi Li's rejection made him a little disappointed, but the feeling of treasure in front of him made him decide to ignore this little displeasure. Walking to the dragon chair behind the imperial table, Tan Jiji looked at Yi Li and Dr. Lin with satisfaction, then slowly reached out to open the box. Fortunately, this time there wasn't anything on the box that would cause a headache, so Tan Jiji easily opened the box. Carefully, he took out a jade seal from the inside. Yi Li raised her eyebrows. This should be the imperial jade seal made by the first emperor 1,000 years ago. On it were engraved the words, "Receiving the mandate of heaven, long life and prosperity." It was said that the first emperor of the previous dynasty had indeed obtained the imperial jade seal, but none of the subsequent emperors had taken out the imperial jade seal. After the first emperor of the Dechu state ruled the world, he turned the previous dynasty's old palace upside down, but still couldn't find it. So the history books generally believed that the first emperor of the previous dynasty had obtained the imperial jade seal, but it was just a rumor. It only existed in the unofficial history. Tan Jiji happily held the imperial jade seal, the expression on his face becoming even more mesmerized. It was as if he could already control the life and death of the world and unify the world. When he was finally intoxicated enough, he began to carefully feel the imperial jade seal in his hand. Gradually, his expression became somewhat stiff, and then slowly revealed a frightened expression. How could this be? Yi Li didn't understand. He flipped the imperial jade seal around and looked at it for a long time. Finally, he suddenly stood up and waved his hand, sweeping all the things on the imperial table to the ground. Then he threw the imperial jade seal down as well. How could this be? Yi Li blinked, dodging the things that fell from above, and looked at the imperial jade seal that had rolled to her feet. Carefully bending down to pick it up, it was indeed a rare good jade, with a coiling dragon engraved on it. There were also the 8 words in the legend. Regardless of size or appearance, it was exactly the same as what was recorded in the history books. But, why was there such a big word on the bottom right corner of the imperial jade seal? Dr. Lin also picked up the red sandalwood box that Tan Jiji had dropped. There was also a piece of cloth in the box. Yi Li glanced sideways and saw 2 lines of arrogant words written on it. Unfilial descendant who dares to disturb my mausoleum, will I tell you where the true imperial jade seal and treasure are? Behind it were 3 words that were even more arrogant, ha. 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 Yi Li couldn't help but twitch her lips. At this point, if he still couldn't figure out the origins of this founding ancestor, she wouldn't be able to survive. However, while others were cheating their fathers, this Emperor Gaozu was actually cheating his descendants. Tan Jiji naturally saw the cloth in Dr. Lin's hand. He quickly jumped down the steps and grabbed the cloth in Dr. Lin's hand. However, the look on his face after that made Yi Li somewhat unable to bear to look at him. This hopeful descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family had really been cheated by his ancestor. The cloth in Tan Jiji's hand fell to the ground. Yi Li helplessly watched as he walked out in a daze. She turned to Dr. Lin and said, "Master, will he be okay going out like this? His mental endurance is a bit too weak." Dr. Lin sighed and chased after him. Yi Li gritted her teeth and lowered her head to look at the cloth with some difficulty. Her lips revealed a faint smile as she put it into her sleeve. She turned to look at the portrait of the emperor in the main hall and turned to follow him out. If she let those two people leave, she wouldn't be able to leave alone. However, if Tan Jiji hadn't been driven mad by his unfilial ancestor, he wouldn't leave her behind. Ryang City. In Ryang City, in the most remote corner of the western part of the city, there was an unremarkable courtyard. From the outside, this small courtyard was the same as all the other courtyards in Ryang City. There wasn't anything special about it. Every day, the owner of this courtyard would go out to buy groceries, go shopping, and take a stroll like his neighbors. However, when you really entered this small courtyard, you would find that it was a completely different world from the outside. This was because this was where the most mysterious and elite Qi Lin of the Ding Kingdom's imperial residence was stationed. As long as an ordinary person stepped into this courtyard, they would fall into the hands of the Qi Lin who were resting and learning here. Then, they would suffer a painful experience that was definitely enough to make anyone regret living in this world. In the middle of the night, a dark shadow quietly swept in from outside the wall. His superior Qin Gong allowed him to land on the ground without making a single sound. The man in black cautiously and quickly glanced at the entire courtyard. Then, he lifted his feet and wanted to walk towards his destination. "Don't move." A low voice sounded behind him. The man in black was startled. His eyes darkened and he obediently stood in the same place. Qi Lin is indeed worthy of being regarded as a fierce tiger by the West Hill. "I admire you." The moment he spoke, someone had quietly come to his side and casually patted him a few times. All the weapons he carried on him were found. The man in black did not resist. Of course, he knew that there was definitely more than one person watching him in the courtyard. "You are not bad to be able to find your way here. Come with me to see the commander." "Mr. Han." The man in black, Han Mingyue, was startled. Finally, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. "You already knew that." The man beside him sneered. "If you didn't know, do you think that you could find this place?" Han Mingyue was speechless. He obediently followed the man beside him inside. Under the candlelight, Qin Feng was still sitting in the study, reviewing thick files. More than a month ago, more than 300 elites from the army and the Shadow Guard were selected to receive initial training outside the city. Relying on their own training experience and the large amount of information left behind by the princess, they finally managed to get on track. As the commander of Qi Lin, Qin Feng insisted on checking the records of these trained soldiers every day to evaluate their future potential. At the same time, he further trained himself and the original members according to the information left behind by the princess. Therefore, Qin Feng was so busy every day that he did not have time to think about those infuriating things. Of course, whether this busyness was inevitable or deliberate, Qin Feng did not intend to find out. Therefore, when he saw Han Mingyue being escorted in, Qin Feng's mood immediately became bad. He was very busy, and Han Mingyue's arrival would undoubtedly make him even busier. More importantly, Han Mingyue's appearance would remind him of some unpleasant things. "Mr. Han, why are you here so late at night?" Leaning against the chair and stretching his stiff neck, Qin Feng lazily narrowed his eyes. His half-opened eyes revealed an undisguised danger. Han Mingyue was not surprised that anyone related to Yili would never like him. Han Mingyue cupped his hands at Qin Feng and said with a faint smile, "Sorry to disturb you, Commander Qin." Chapter 394. Qin Feng glanced at him indifferently, as if to say, "Since you know you're bothering me, why are you still here?" "I would like to see Zui die." "Commander Qin, please make an exception." Han Mingyue knew that if he didn't mention it, Qin Feng wouldn't mention it to him, so he didn't beat around the bush. Since Su Zui Dai had been handed over to Qin Feng by Mo Xiaoyao 2 months ago, she had been taken away from the governor's office. After all, the governor's office wasn't big enough to accommodate everyone in the Ding King's office. Therefore, the Shadow Guard, Qi Lin, and most of the civil officials and generals had left the governor's office to find another place to live. Now, the only ones still living in the governor's office were Mo Xiuyao, his trusted aides Feng Zhiyao, Su Qingze, and the others, as well as him, who had nowhere to go for the time being. Han Mingyue hadn't seen Su Zui die since she was taken away. He couldn't help but worry about it. Without the Tianyi Pavilion, it took Han Mingyue a lot of effort to find Su Zui Dai's whereabouts, even in this small Ruyang city. Now, it seemed that even this was the result of someone going easy on him. Han Mingyue couldn't help but smile bitterly. At the same time, a sense of powerlessness rose in his heart. Without the Tianyi Pavilion and the Han family, young Master Mingyue was just an ordinary person. Su Zui Dai. Qin Feng was startled for a moment, as if he just remembered this person. His face darkened slightly. If you want to see Su Zui Dai, young Master Han will have to personally explain it to the prince. Han Mingyue smiled bitterly. If he could persuade Mo Xiuyao, why would he barge in so late at night? Looking at his expression, Qin Feng understood what he meant. He said calmly, without the prince's permission. Young Master Han, even if you came with thousands of soldiers and horses, you wouldn't be able to see Su Zui Dai, let alone if you came alone. Han Mingyue raised his sword-like eyebrows slightly. He knew that Qin Feng's subordinates were all very powerful. Although there was no detailed information, their achievements in the past 6 months were enough to prove their strength. However, to say that they could defeat an army of thousands of men and horses was a bit too confident. However, he couldn't bring out such a huge army right now. Qin Feng observed his expression with great interest. He leaned back in his chair and said with a smile, "Mr. Han, you've misunderstood. Qi Lin will do anything to achieve his goal, but he will never seek his own death by confronting force with force. What I mean is, without Prince's permission, even if young Master Han barges in, I will kill her the moment young Master Han sees her. If young Master Han wants to see the scene of Su Zui taking her last breath, feel free to give it a try." Han Mingyue was silent. He knew that Qin Feng was not joking. Although Yili wasn't killed by Su Zui herself, but if it wasn't for her hidden weapon, Yili wouldn't have fallen off the cliff. If it wasn't for Mo Xiuyao wanting Su Zui to live, he was afraid that the people from the Ding Palace would have already dismembered her into pieces. With a sigh, Han Mingyue said, "I only want to see her once. It's fine if I don't speak." Qin Feng had already picked up the file again. It was obvious that he wanted to see the guest out. "Young Master Qin, let me see Zui once. I will use a top-secret information to exchange with you," Han Mingyue said in a deep voice. Qin Feng didn't even lift his eyelids. He just said indifferently, "Qi Lin doesn't have any mission at the moment. He doesn't collect information. If young Master Han has anything to say, you can look for Prince." Han Mingyue smiled bitterly. Because of Su Zui's matter, he had already looked for Mo Xiuyao twice. Mo Xiuyao had already made it clear that if he saw him again, he would either throw him to the genom of Gojoseon of the Western Tomb, or let him accompany Su Zui. He really wanted to see Su Zui, but that was to protect her life. If he was really thrown to accompany Su Zui, then it would really be over. "Commander Qin, your prince will definitely be interested in this information. Moreover, this is also related to Princess Ding's death." Qin Feng's hand that was flipping through the file paused for a moment. He seemed to be considering for a moment before he said, "Tell me about it. I want to see Zui first." Han Mingyue didn't forget Qin Feng's words just now. Qi Lin would do anything to achieve his goal, so it was obvious that burning the bridge after crossing the river was included. Qin Feng raised his eyebrows, stood up and said, "No problem. You can see her, but you can't speak. She can't see you either." After he finished speaking, he grinned at Han Mingyue and said, "I'm not worried that young Master Han will go back on his words. Similarly, if your information doesn't satisfy me, you will soon see what kind of punishment Su Zui will have to endure because of you." Han Mingyue's body stiffened. He stared at Qin Feng for a long time before he sighed and said, "Princess Ding's methods of teaching people are really amazing." Qin Feng shrugged and said with a cold smile, "It could have been even better." "Please, young Master Han." Looking at the scene in front of him, Han Mingyue's heart was filled with mixed feelings. He really couldn't tell if he regretted trying so hard to see Su Zuodi or not. They were standing in an extremely simple and ordinary room. Normal people definitely wouldn't be able to find anything special here. But after the mechanism on the wall was opened, they could see that behind the wall was an empty secret room. And it was under their feet. They were high up and could see the entire secret room. With just a glance, Han Mingyue saw Su Zuodi. Because there was only Su Zuodi in the room at this time, but Han Mingyue seriously doubted whether the person on the ground was Su Zuodi or not. Su Zuodi's gray prison clothes were full of filth and bloodstains. She lay weakly on the dirty ground. Even if they were standing at such a high place, they could still faintly smell the unpleasant smell coming from below. Han Mingyue could clearly see that her fingers were strangely twisted, lying limply on the ground. Her leg was also twisted. Even though she was unconscious, her leg still spasmed from time to time. Her face was full of pain, and she shook her head and muttered something from time to time. If one looked carefully, they would find that she was saying, "I was wrong. Spare me. Help, what did you do to her?" Finally, he couldn't help but ask. Qin Feng didn't care and said indifferently, "Don't tell me that the Tianyi Pavilion didn't torture her. Don't worry, my people aren't all greenhorns. Even if they don't know when to stop, they won't take her life." Han Mingyue couldn't help but shudder. Of course he knew about those secret torture methods. Young Master Mingyue wasn't a living Buddha. He had once tortured the enemies who fell into his hands without batting an eyelid, but he had never thought that those methods would be used on the woman he loved most. She's just a weak woman. How could she bear those methods? Qin Feng shrugged. Who cared if she could bear it or not, as long as she didn't die? In fact, she can bear it better than the average person. Regarding this point, Qin Feng still viewed Su Zuodi in a new light. Torture was not something that could be learned just by talking about it. Of course, it required training, and training naturally required people. Su Zuodi wasn't alone. In fact, there were two other people who came in with Su Zuodi, two men who knew martial arts. Without going easy on them, the two men couldn't stand it and committed suicide. Su Zuodi was still alive. Actually, we can't be blamed for this. The princess consort was originally very opposed to this kind of bloody interrogation method. She was also very knowledgeable about it. Unfortunately, she disappeared before she could teach us everything. So, we can only trouble Miss Su to continue using the old method. Also, young Master Han, you don't have to worry. The injuries on her body aren't. Well, except for her leg, they aren't irreversible. Someone would help her reattach her finger bones tomorrow morning. With the healing elixir provided by Mr. Shen, she will recover in 10 days. Chapter 395. Han Mingyue's face darkened. After she recovers, I'll let you break her. Pinch and break her fingers. Her fingers are too slender, so it's not easy to break them unless they're completely smashed. Qin Feng corrected her. Like this, will her hand be able to fully recover in the future? Han Mingyue roared. Just from Qin Feng's tone, she understood that this was not the first time, nor would it be the last. No matter how good Shen Yang's medicine was, it was impossible not to leave behind some side effects. Qin Feng raised his brows, calmly asking, "Does Mr. Han think she still has a chance to leave?" Prince did not say that he would guarantee that she would be unharmed. In fact, the fact that Su Zuodi was still intact was already a sign that his subordinates had a good sense of propriety. "Mr. Han, don't worry. We won't touch her face. If Mr. Han's information satisfies me, you can take some time to draw 2 portraits as a souvenir." Prince said that if you make her too ugly, you'll scare the princess consort and the little heir. Han Mingyue's face turned ashen, but she could not say anything. Finally, she took a deep look at the woman lying on the ground, breathing weakly, and turned to follow Qin Feng out of the room. The man by Mo Jingqi's side, called Tan Jiji, is a descendant of the previous dynasty's royal family. Facing Qin Feng's cold eyes, Han Mingyue said. Qin Feng narrowed his eyes. Mr. Han, are you playing with me? A descendant of the previous dynasty's royal family? If it was in the past, this would be good news. But now, they and Mo Jingqi could be said to be like fire and water. Who had the time to care if the people by his side were descendants of the previous dynasty? Even if Mo Jingqi was a descendant of the previous dynasty, it had nothing to do with them. Han Mingyue coldly said, although Tan Jiji only officially appeared in court this year, he has been by Mo Jingqi's side for more than 10 years. He is Mo Jingqi's most trusted confidant and think tank. Do you think this is important? Mo Jingqi's confidant and think tank. Qin Feng's brows furrowed. To be able to be selected by Mo Xiuyao and given to Yi Li from the many Black Cloud Cavalry members, as well as obtain Yi Li's approval to become Qi Lin's commander, regardless of which aspect Qin Feng's abilities were at least above average. Therefore, after hearing Han Mingyue's words, Qin Feng immediately understood what Han Mingyue was trying to say. As a descendant of the previous dynasty, even if it had been more than 200 years since the fall of the previous dynasty, for such a person to appear beside the current emperor as a trusted aide, it would always attract some attention and vigilance. Of course, Qin Feng would not forget that when Mo Jingqi attempted to seize military power from Princess Consort in the Chu capital, this person called Tan Jiji had made things difficult for Princess Consort. In just a moment, Qin Feng's mind had turned hundreds of times. Staring at Han Mingyue in front of him, Qin Feng said expressionlessly, "How can I believe that what you said is not true? Also, if this information is not even known to the Prince Ding mansion, how did young Master Han know?" Han Mingyue said indifferently, "In any case, I was once the head of the Tianyi Pavilion. The Tianyi Pavilion had the largest source of information in the world. What was so strange about knowing some information that others did not know?" Qin Feng snorted softly. If it was other information, this one might not find it strange. But in the Chu capital, does the Tianyi Pavilion really have the ability to find out information that even the Prince Ding mansion does not know? These years, not only did the emperor keep an eye on the Ding mansion, but the Ding mansion also never relaxed their guard against Mo Jingqi. Otherwise, the Ding mansion would have been swallowed by the royal family during these years when Prince Ding was seriously ill and shut himself in. If you don't believe me, I have nothing to say. This person is definitely involved in Princess Ding's matter this time. You can think about it. If Mo Xiuyao and Mo Jingqi break off their relationship, who will really benefit? Of course, it would be the surrounding countries and Mo Jingli who occupied the land. Of course, if what Han Mingyue said was true, then Tan Jiji would also be counted as one of them. In fact, whether Qin Feng believed it or not, this kind of information had to be reported to Mo Xiuyao. However, Mo Xiuyao's reaction to this made Han Mingyue turn pale with fright. Cut off Su Zuodi's left arm. You're crazy. Looking at the calm Mo Xiuyao, Han Mingyue roared angrily. Mo Xiuyao raised his head to look at him and said indifferently, "Tell me the source of the information. Otherwise, in less than 2 hours, I will cut off a part of Su Zuodi's arm and give it to you." "I told you." Han Mingyue said angrily. "I don't believe you." Mo Xiuyao pushed away the account book in front of him and said, "Don't forget who has the Tianyi Pavilion. I know how many people you have in the capital. Or are you telling me that you're hiding something from me from the deal you made with me? If that's the case, I can still kill Su Zuodi." Han Mingyue looked at him with a complicated expression. "Don't forget that her father and brother died for your Mo family." Mo Xiuyao leaned back in his chair. His pale face was filled with fatigue and indifference. "So what?" I said. "If Miss Li doesn't come this year, no one can save her. Yi Li was already dead. Han Mingyue really wanted to shout this out, but looking at Imo Xiuyao's indifferent eyes, he couldn't say it. Or rather, he didn't dare. He wasn't sure what the consequences would be if he shouted this out. Imo Xiuyao, you're crazy. Han Mingyue said in a low voice. Imo Xiuyao sneered in a low voice. He didn't care about Han Mingyue's evaluation at all. I've always been more clear-headed than you. I know what I want to do. Han Mingyue, do you know? He wanted to wait for Miss Li and their baby to come back. If Miss Li didn't come, he would kill slowly. He would kill those who wanted to hurt Miss Li and those who got in their way, until Miss Li came back or he died. Now, tell me the answer. Or do you want Su Zuodi's arm? Han Mingyue closed his eyes in defeat. He began to doubt whether telling Imo Xiuyao this information was right or wrong. Zuodi told me. Ha, interesting. Imo Xiuyao laughed softly. Su Zuodi told you. A woman far away in Xiling, a woman who was treated as a chess piece by Genom of Gojoseon that could be discarded at any time, would actually know such secret information? Qin Feng, Xue Jing. Your subordinates are here. The two men stepped forward to accept the order. Imo Xiuyao said coldly, I want an answer from Su Zuodi within a day. I don't care what method you use. The two men looked at each other and said, your subordinates obey. Qin Feng and Xue Jing accepted the order and left. Han Mingyue looked at Imo Xiuyao in bewilderment, unable to speak for a long time. Imo Xiuyao rubbed between his eyebrows, threw down the scroll in his hand, and looked coldly at Han Mingyue and said, Han Mingyue, you should know why I put up with you until now. Han Mingyue lowered his head and smiled bitterly, I know. Naturally, it's not because of our friendship. Imo Xiuyao said, you should be glad that you have a good brother. You should be even more glad that Han Mingxi is a friend that Miss Li acknowledges. Don't cause trouble for him. He won't be able to save you every time. Han Mingyue was silent. He knew that Han Mingxi had been in Ryang City all this time. Although the two brothers hadn't met, he could still sense that Han Mingxi had secretly sent people to take care of him. Han Mingxi was worried about hurting his pride, so he rarely let him know what he did. He was afraid that the one who secretly inquired about the Qilin's residence was also Han Mingxi, who pleaded for leniency on his behalf. He lowered his head sadly and said, I, as his brother, have wronged him. Chapter 396. Imo Xiuyao snorted. In this life, besides being obsessed with Su Zuodi, who else had Han Mingyue done right? Xiuyao. I beg you, let Zuodi go. Han Mingyue spat out his request with difficulty. Earlier, even if he lowered his stance, he still had chips to negotiate with Imo Xiuyao. But now, he had nothing left and could only beg, get out. Imo Xiuyao said lightly. Xiu. Han Mingyue still wanted to plead for mercy, but he saw a scarlet flash in Imo Xiuyao's eyes and a strong force hit him in the face. Before he could finish his words, Han Mingyue was already sent flying. He fell hard in the courtyard outside the door, and the door of the study was closed in front of his eyes at the same time. Imo Xiuyao's move was fast and ruthless. Han Mingyue didn't even have time to defend himself and was sent flying. He fell to the ground and spat out a mouthful of blood. Brother. A dark red robe silently appeared beside Han Mingyue. Han Mingyue looked up and saw Han Mingxi's originally unruly handsome face full of worry and sadness. Holding Han Mingxi's hand to stand up, Han Mingyue looked at his brother with some shame. He didn't want to appear in front of his brother in such a sorry state. Mingxi, I'm sorry. Han Mingxi shook his head silently and looked at Han Mingyue. Brother, don't waste your time. As long as Jun Weitian doesn't come back, no one can save Su Zuodi. These days, Han Mingxi had given up the idea of persuading his brother to forget Su Zuodi. He just told him that his current efforts were not desirable. The reason why Prince Ding still keeps Su Zuodi alive is not because he can't bear to part with her. It was just that he needed Su Zuidi to live. Letting Su Zuidi die so easily was letting her off easy. Just like how the Mahist army clearly had the ability to kill Marquis Muyang on the battlefield, but Mo Xiaoyao still ordered him to be released. However, no one knew what awaited Marquis Muyang in the future. Yi Li is already dead, Han Mingyue said through gritted teeth. Han Mingxi's expression darkened as he said in a low voice, as long as we don't see her corpse with our own eyes, she's still alive. Big brother, you better pray that Jun Wei's corpse isn't really found, otherwise. No one knew what Mo Xiaoyao would do. Ever since Jun Wei's accident, Mo Xiaoyao gave people the feeling that he was too strong. Other than killing the 7,000 soldiers who were searching for Jun Wei and expelling the Dechu state soldiers who were stationed outside Feihong Pass, he did not show any attitude towards the death of the princess. However, Han Mingxi was close to the core of the Prince Ding mansion. Even if Mo Xiaoyao did not say anything, he could faintly feel that Mo Xiaoyao was setting up a trap. Once he really made his move, it would be accompanied by endless bloodshed. If Princess Ding, Han Mingxi shook his head and said indifferently, a dragon has a reverse scale. If you touch it, you will die. Big brother, you're on your own now. Imperial Mausoleum. In the cold Imperial Mausoleum, Tanjiji's face was even colder than the entire Imperial Mausoleum. Being played by his ancestor caused him to have no place to vent the anger in his chest. Yi Li was very perceptive and did not provoke him at this time. The three left the White Jade Palace. Ever since Yi Li opened the door to the palace, all the mechanisms in the Imperial Mausoleum seemed to have disappeared. Even the bridge pier that had sunk into the river of water rose back to its original position. The three retreated to a stone room on the outside of the Imperial Mausoleum before sitting down to rest. After a long day, Yi Li was tired. She walked to a stone chair in the corner and sat down. She took out the dry food and water she had brought with her and started to eat. Tan Jiji sat across from her, leaning against the wall as he casually sat on the ground. His face no longer had the pride and confidence from before. His already gloomy face now had hints of decadence and viciousness. Princess Ding is very happy right now. Seeing Yi Li calmly eat, Tan Jiji asked darkly. Yi Li's hand that was holding the dry food paused. She faintly smiled and said, Tan official, what are you saying? Sitting in such a gloomy place, Ben Fei can't be happy. How could Tan Jiji believe her? He laughed coldly and said, seeing that this one came up empty and Wang Fei saw a joke, how could you not be happy? Yi Li looked sincerely at him and said with certainty, Ben Fei doesn't like to rejoice in other people's misfortunes. Hearing this, Tan Jiji's face twisted again. He quickly stared at Yi Li and smiled, even though this one came up empty, but, meeting Princess Ding and the future Prince Ding's heir, I didn't lose out. Of course, I have to thank father. Dr. Lin ignored him with a cold face and pretended not to hear him. Yi Li smiled and said, I also have to thank master. If it weren't for master's help, Ben Fei wouldn't have been able to wait until today to see Tan official. Tan Jiji looked at Yi Li strangely and didn't use words to force her. He had been by Yi Li's side longer than most people thought, so he naturally had some understanding of Yi Li. If the person Mo Jingqi hated the most in this world was Mo Xiaoyao, the person he hated the most was probably Yi Li. Although in Tan Jiji's view, this hatred was purely due to Mo Jingqi's own brain damage. In Mo Jingqi's view, King Ding's mansion, which was already on the verge of collapse, and Mo Xiaoyao, who was already half dead, completely lost control because of Yi Li's appearance. This made Mo Jingqi feel anger and hatred, as if 10 years of work had been destroyed in an instant. Compared to Mo Xiaoyao, Mo Jingqi probably hoped that Yi Li would die first. Although Tan Jiji didn't agree with Mo Jingqi's inexplicable hatred, this didn't prevent him from attaching importance to Yi Li. Of course, he understood that a woman like Yi Li wasn't someone he could control with just a few words. Tan Jiji's eyes turned slightly, and he tactfully changed the topic. It's been so long. Doesn't Princess want to know how Prince Ding is doing? Yili tugged the corner of her lips and gave him a fake smile. Is Tan official willing to tell me? Tan Jiji smiled and said, it's my honor to be able to speak with Princess. Speaking of which, His Highness Prince Ding is really devoted to Princess. On the second day after Princess fell off the cliff, the 7,000 soldiers at the foot of the mountain were all beheaded. His Highness Prince Ding also withdrew all the Mahist army that was originally resisting Nanzhao and Xiling. Now Dechu's state can be said to be in endless war. Seeing Yili frown, Tan Jiji continued, if that's the case, it's fine. Prince Ding also expelled all the Dechu state troops outside Feihong Pass and killed all the soldiers who resisted. Now, who doesn't know that Prince Ding has rebelled? His Highness is furious for a woman. Princess, are you very touched? Yi Li's expression didn't change. Thank you, Tan official, for telling me. As a woman, knowing Prince's actions, I'm naturally very touched. Tan Jiji raised an eyebrow. Princess comes from the Su family in Yunzhou. The Su family has always been loyal. Does Princess have nothing else to say? Yi Li smiled apologetically and said, married women follow their husbands. No matter what Prince does, even if the world curses him, in this Fei's eyes, he is always right. To have a wife like this, His Highness Prince Ding is truly blessed. Tan Jiji gritted his teeth. Yi Li smiled and said, Tan official is too kind. In reality, compared to my prince, I'm more interested in Tan official's matters. Chapter 397. Tan Jiji was startled, staring warily at the woman in plain clothes who was smiling brightly in front of him. Yi Li waved her hand, smiling faintly. Official Tan doesn't need to be nervous. Since you've already let this consort know your identity, you don't care about anything else, right? Tan Jiji was silent. That's right, his biggest secret was his identity. If this was no longer a secret, then what else could he not say? Raising his head, Tan Jiji's lips held a trace of a smile. It was a pity that he was used to having a gloomy face and could not look elegant. However, no one cared. Tan Jiji raised his brows and smiled. To be able to interest the princess, this one is really flattered. Yi Li smiled. Official Tan doesn't need to be so polite. This consort doesn't need to guess why Official Tan has been by Mo Jingqi's side for so many years. It must be for that matter, right? Tan Jiji nodded slightly. That's right. As a descendant of the previous dynasty, there was no need to guess why he would spend so much effort to hide by the emperor's side. Official Tan, have you seen how many descendants of the previous dynasty have succeeded in reviving the country? Yi Li put down the dry food in her hands and poured out some water to clean her hands. Tan Jiji's face darkened, staring coldly at Yi Li. Yi Li smiled. Official Tan doesn't need to worry. This consort isn't mocking you. Official Tan might as well think about this consort's question. Indeed, not many have succeeded. Does the princess have any brilliant ideas? I don't dare to have any brilliant ideas. In fact, reviving a country is far more difficult than establishing a country, isn't it? The previous dynasty has been around for 200 years. Which commoner would risk their lives for a descendant of the royal family who has been extinct for so many generations? As a descendant of the previous dynasty, what benefits can Official Tan give them to make them risk their lives for you? Official Tan wants to revive the country, but you don't know, where will the money, soldiers, and talents come from? Official Tan doesn't think that once the Ding King's manor is gone and Mo Jingqi is killed, the Dechu state will return to you, right? Although Official Tan didn't get the treasure you wanted this time, this mausoleum is still worth a lot of money. This one thanks Wang Fei for the reminder. Tan Jiji looked at Yi Li for a while and cupped his hands in acknowledgement. Yi Li was silent. I didn't remind you. I just wanted to hurt you. But it made sense. How could a person who wanted to restore his country and could endure humiliation and lurk by Mo Jingqi's side for so many years be completely unprepared? Yili thought about the information she had just learned from Tan Jiji, but there was not the slightest fluctuation on her face. Yili had always been good at keeping her distance when interacting with others. She knew very well that she could not continue. If she continued, Tan Jiji wouldn't want to use her to negotiate with Mo Xiaoyao. Instead, he wanted to kill her to silence her. Yili didn't want to speak, but Tan Jiji was clearly very interested in Yili. Speaking of which, with Wang Fei's intelligence, how could she have been forced to marry Prince Ding? Or perhaps, before our emperor knew, Princess Consort and His Highness Prince Ding were already in love? Official Tan, you've read too many novels, haven't you? This consort has good taste. Yili glanced at him and said indifferently. Good taste? Tan Jiji asked with amusement. He clearly snorted disdainfully at Yili's words. No matter how one looked at it, marrying Mo Xiaoyao was not a good thing. Yili pursed her lips and decided not to explain the problem of her taste to outsiders. If one simply looked at it from the perspective of a woman in this era, marrying Mo Xiaoyao was indeed not a good thing. But to Yili, it was the best choice. She didn't have to deal with countless women in the back courtyards. She didn't have to spend the rest of her life talking about rouge and face powder with the noble ladies. She also didn't have to live in a small world for the rest of her life. Even if she had prepared for this kind of life, why wouldn't she want a better choice? Even if it was far from the peace and quiet she had hoped for, there was always a price to pay. She couldn't hope to enjoy the freedom she had in her previous life without any responsibilities or obligations. Other people's views and opinions were not important. Many things were just like drinking water. What Mo Xiaoyao had given her made her happy and she was willing to do anything for him. That was all. Although the treasures in the imperial tomb were fake, the size of the tomb did not disappoint the reputation of the imperial tomb. According to the map, other than the necessary rest, there were no delays. The three of them walked for an entire day before they reached the exit. Walking out of the imperial tomb, Yili closed her eyes in discomfort at the sunlight that greeted her. She raised her hand to cover her eyes. After a while, she opened them again and saw Tan Jiji looking at her with a smile. Princess truly trusts this one. Yili smiled faintly and said, if official Tan wanted to make a move against this consort, wouldn't you have done it in the imperial tomb? Official Tan can rest assured, this consort will not run away. After all, my child is the most important. Tan Jiji nodded in satisfaction. It's good that Princess understands. To be honest, this one doesn't want to be rough with Princess. Ever since meeting Tan Jiji, Dr. Lin had become very quiet. Most of the time, it was Yili and Tan Jiji who were talking. Dr. Lin only listened with a cold face as the two of them tested each other. Standing at the bottom of the cliff, he watched as the entrance to the imperial tomb slowly closed and disappeared without a trace. Dr. Lin turned and walked forward. Tan Jiji's face darkened as he stared at Dr. Lin's back and said, Father, where do you want to go? Dr. Lin turned around and coldly said, You've already entered the imperial tomb. Do you still need to care where an old man like me goes? Tan Jiji looked at Dr. Lin with a complicated expression. After a moment of silence, he said, Father, I want the location of the imperial tomb. Dr. Lin's face revealed a trace of shock. He stared at Tan Jiji and said, You think this imperial tomb is fake? Tan Jiji stood with his hands behind his back. There's nothing inside. Isn't it obvious? Dr. Lin chuckled, I told you before that there are no treasures in the imperial tomb, but you didn't believe me. Now that you've seen it with your own eyes, you're suspecting that this is not the real imperial tomb. Are you trying to say that this old man has hidden the real treasure? Tan Jiji did not speak. His expression seemed to indicate that he agreed with Dr. Lin's words. A trace of sadness and pain flashed across Dr. Lin's face. He stared at Tan Jiji and sneered, Good. Good. Even if I did hide the treasure, what are you going to do about it? Kill an old man like me? Father. Tan Jiji clenched his teeth as he stared at Dr. Lin with a hint of ruthlessness in his eyes. He proudly stared at Dr. Lin's slightly hunched figure and coldly said, "Have you forgotten? You are not my biological father. Those treasures don't belong to the Tan family." A mocking smile appeared on Dr. Lin's face, but in Yi Li's eyes, it looked more like crying. "Then don't forget, you still carry the Tan family's surname." Tan Jiji's expression changed, and his face became even uglier. I say, shouldn't we leave this place first? We should still be near Ruyang, right?" Yi Li suddenly asked. Chapter 398. Tan Jiji paused and finally swallowed the words he was about to say. He looked at Dr. Lin and said stiffly, "Come with me." Dr. Lin raised his white eyebrows and was about to speak when Yi Li reached out and grabbed his arm. Yi Li said apologetically, "Master, I seem to be feeling a little unwell. I'll have to trouble you to take a look at me later." Dr. Lin was stunned for a moment. He looked deeply at Yi Li and finally stopped objecting. Suppressing the father and son who were about to have a fierce conflict, Yi Li sighed slightly in her heart. She carelessly touched the piece of cloth in her sleeve and followed the footsteps of Tan Jiji who was walking in front of her. Tan Jiji walked forward and looked back at Yi Li, saying, "My men are not far from here. Princess, don't be agitated. We won't go to Ruyang this time. So you may not be able to see His Highness Prince Ding for the time being." Yi Li smiled faintly, saying, "Since I've fallen into your hands, I'll naturally listen to your arrangements. But I'm a little curious. Does Lord Tan plan to take me back to the capital?" Tan Jiji smiled, saying, "Why would you think so? What good will it do me to take you back to the capital?" Yi Li lowered her eyes, "Then I'm even more curious. What excuse did Lord Tan use to leave the capital for so long? Mo Jingqi's suspicious heart is not clear." Tan Jiji smiled slightly proudly, saying, "Since I can gain His Majesty's trust, how can I not even spare a little time? As for where you're going, you'll know when you arrive." Yi Li smiled, "In that case, I'll wait and see. Since you could deceive Mo Jingqi for so many years, let me see if you have the ability to walk out of Feihong Pass." This was a very inconspicuous town not far from Ruyang City. It was also the first town they saw after leaving the Imperial Mausoleum. There were no more than 100 families in total. Every 2 days, the people from the nearby villages would bring the things they needed to exchange for other things they needed. Only then would it become more lively. When they entered the town, they were just in time to catch up with the town's market. Tan Jiji had changed his clothes, and the three of them looked like a family of 3, an old man and a young couple. They were not too eye-catching. Stepping into a shabby inn, the three of them were quickly welcomed to the backyard of the inn. This was clearly a stronghold that Tan Jiji had prepared beforehand. It was completely different from the shabby front of the inn. The backyard was clean and quiet, unlike the scenery of a small town in the northwest. The moment he stepped into the courtyard, someone came out to welcome him. "Jiji, you're finally back." A beautiful woman wearing a blue robe walked towards them. She didn't care that there were other people present. She rushed into Tan Jiji's arms and said, "Jiji, you're finally back. I've been worried for a long time. I was afraid that you had an accident." Tan Jiji was obviously very indulgent towards this young woman. His originally gloomy face had a bit of a smile. He softly said, "Aren't I fine? I've made you worry." The blue-robed woman withdrew from his arms. Only then did she see Yi Li and Dr. Lin standing to the side. Of course, her eyes were mainly focused on Yi Li. Pointing at Yi Li, her eyes were filled with jealousy and disgust. "Who is this woman?" Yi Li's mouth twitched. "Big sister, can't you see that I'm still pregnant? Isn't this jealousy a bit too fierce?" Tan Jiji quickly pulled her back and softly comforted her. "Lin, she's still useful. You can't touch her. You know that I only have you in my heart." The blue-robed woman was not satisfied because of this. She stared at Tanjiji. You still haven't told me who she is. Tanjiji helplessly smiled and said, she is Princess Ding, so, don't hurt her. A sharp light flashed in the blue-robed woman's eyes. Leaning against Tanjiji, she looked at Yili. Princess Ding. Didn't Princess Ding die? How could she appear here? Tanjiji softly said, we met by accident. Have someone look after her. The blue-robed woman smiled brightly and said, don't worry. When have I ever failed to do what you've asked me to do? Tanjiji nodded and turned to Yili. Princess Ding will be staying here for 2 days. If you have any problems, you can tell Lin. She will help you. Yili did not have any objections to this. However, the blue-robed woman was unhappy. She glared at Tanjiji and said, what do you mean? I'm not her servant. Thus, Tanjiji coaxed her with sweet words. After a long time, he finally managed to cheer her up. With a soft snort, he said, all right, I'll take good care of her. Yili did not care about the two of them flirting in front of her. She only lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. However, her mind was racing. She had never seen this woman called Lin before, but her voice sounded familiar. She inadvertently raised her head and glanced at the blue-robed woman. She looked to be in her early 20s and was very beautiful. There was a trace of strange charm between her eyebrows. However, the way she looked at Tanjiji seemed to be filled with love. And her voice. She spoke the language of the Central Plains very well. However, people like Yili, who had received some special listening training, could still detect that there were some sounds in her pronunciation. Yili had only seen one person who spoke like this before. It was Nanzhao's Princess Anxi. Looking at the blue-robed woman in front of her, Yili's expression did not change. Lin. The saintess of Nanjiang, Shu Manlin. It seemed that their previous guesses had been wrong. They had all thought that Shu Manlin and Mo Jingli were in cahoots. Now it seemed. Mo Jingli was just a tool and a shield. The true mastermind was the young man with a gentle smile in front of her, Tanjiji. Thinking this through, Yili's evaluation of Tanjiji reached a new height. He was a quiet and unknown figure who was able to play 2 countries in the palm of his hand. Compared to the sometimes crazy and sometimes impulsive Mo Jingqi and the brainless Mo Jingli, this man in front of her was the one she should be wary of. Princess, what are you thinking about? Tanjiji finally finished communicating with the blue-robed woman. He turned to stare at Yili and asked probingly. Yili glanced faintly at him. How could she be lost in thought in a place like this? It's nothing. Seeing that Tan official and Miss Lin have such a good relationship, I can't help but feel a bit emotional. The blue-robed woman leaned against Tanjiji and giggled, Princess Ding, Mrs. Prince Ding. Yili smiled and did not refute. She said faintly, I've been away from home for a long time. Not only do I miss Prince, I'm also worried about my family. This princess did not receive any news from Big Brother before this incident. Does Tan official have any news? Big Brother? Tanjiji stilled and quickly reacted, Princess is talking about the eldest son of the Su family, Su Qingchen. Yili nodded. She clearly saw the blue-robed woman's expression stiffen. A trace of resentment and unwillingness flashed through her eyes. She smiled slightly in her heart. It seemed that the woman in front of her was indeed Saint Lady Shu Manlin of Nanjiang. Although she didn't see Shu Manlin's true face that day in the secret chamber of the Southern Kingdom's imperial palace, she heard her voice talking to her elder brother. The obsession and craziness in her voice for her elder brother didn't seem like the woman in front of her who was so attached to Tanjiji. As expected, were they all masters of acting? Chapter 399. She was placed in the deepest room of the courtyard, and Tanjiji did not appear again. Instead, the beautiful woman in blue came to take a look from time to time, saying that she was taking care of her, and then said some provocative and mocking words. Every time she saw Yili smiling calmly, she only gnashed her teeth in anger. Yili was not dissatisfied with this. Tanjiji did not allow his subordinates to talk to her or have contact with her. After a long time, Yili was worried that she would have depression. It was good to have someone to grind her teeth. However, Yili was a little curious. Was this woman targeting her because of Tanjiji or because of Su Qingchen? You can endure it. After taking her pulse, Dr. Lin said as he packed up his things. Yili leisurely leaned back in the chair and drank the tonic that had just been stewed. She smiled and said, "It's not that I can't endure it. Master, don't you think that your life now is much more comfortable than in the imperial mausoleum and that small village? If she needed any tonic or medicine, there would be someone to help her at any time. This was what a pregnant woman should do. She should not follow people she was not familiar with and dig up graves." Dr. Lin looked at her with a complicated expression. "Aren't you worried that he will use you to threaten Prince Ding?" Yili shrugged helplessly. "Since I've already fallen into his hands, what's the use of worrying? Before the child is born, he can't make things difficult for me, right? As for you, Master, I think that Tanjiji knows the danger and still stays in our prince's territory. It's not a good thing." Dr. Lin's expression changed slightly. Of course, he knew why Tanjiji had not left yet. It was not that Tanjiji did not look for him in the past 2 days, but... Dr. Lin's old face smiled bitterly. "If I say that I really don't know, would you believe me?" Yili nodded. "I believe you." Just by looking at the message on the piece of cloth, one could tell that the previous dynasty's great ancestor was an existence that did not care about evil. He was completely capable of not letting anyone know the true whereabouts of himself and the treasure. It's a pity that Tanjiji doesn't believe it. Dr. Lin sighed silently. Dr. Lin looked at Yili and said, "You're not worried at all because you're confident that you can escape from here." "Why?" Yili looked at him with some regret and said, "If it was in the past, this place really wouldn't be able to trap me. But now, Master, I don't have the ability to let a pregnant woman who is 7 months pregnant escape alone. In fact, there was no need to worry about this. If Tanjiji was smart, he should know what benefits he could get by using the chips in his hands." As for Mo Xiaoyao. Thinking of Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li's gaze softened. "Even if we have to pay a price, I believe he won't mind. As long as Lord Tan didn't ask for too much and dream of some impossible conditions." "Lord Tan, who is it?" Tanjiji walked in with a calm face. Beside him was the beautiful saintess of the south, Shu Manlin. Tanjiji looked at the relaxed Yili sitting in the cushioned and comfortable chair. He smiled faintly and said, "Everyone says that a wise man submits to circumstances. Princess really makes this one have a whole new level of respect for you." Yili nodded and accepted his praise. She said, "Fighting to the death with both sides injured is what a boorish man would do. Not to mention, this consort's current situation isn't even enough for both sides to be injured." Tanjiji sneered and said, "Princess is too modest." "That's right, let me tell Princess a piece of good news. It should make Princess happy. Today, soldiers from the Mahist army suddenly appeared in this town. What does Princess think is going on?" Yili's expression was calm and she pretended not to see Tanjiji's probing gaze on her. She smiled faintly and said, "Shouldn't you ask Lord Tan about this? If Lord Tan really suspects that this consort has done something, this consort can't do anything about it, right? I'm a fish on the chopping block." Tanjiji snorted and said, "It's good that Princess understands her situation. It's best if you don't put the little heir in danger. If something happens, not only Prince Ding, but this one will also feel very regretful." Yili raised the teacup in her hand and raised it to Tanjiji. She smiled and said, "Many thanks for Lord Tan's reminder. Since Lord Tan has said so, this consort will give Lord Tan a suggestion. It's best if you leave the northwest as soon as possible. Since you've already attracted the prince's attention, the Mahist army may be easy to deal with. However, the Shadow Guard is not so easy for Lord Tan to deal with. If Qi Lin is attracted because of this. Lord Tan, I really don't want to say whether you've profited or suffered a loss. The corners of Tan Jiji's eyes twitched slightly. He had followed Mo Jingqi for many years and naturally had many dealings with the Shadow Guard. How could he not know how powerful they were? As for Qi Lin. Although he hadn't met him yet, in the past 6 months, Qi Lin's reputation had spread far and wide. Tan Jiji couldn't help but be cautious. Tan Jiji looked at Dr. Lin who was sitting next to him and an unwilling expression flashed across his face. Shu Manlin obviously didn't agree. She stood up and said, Jiji, don't forget the purpose of our trip. If we go back like this. The Imperial Jade Seal, the symbol of the heavens. It was said that the founding treasures of the previous dynasty were countless treasures accumulated by the ancestors of the previous dynasty. After the founding of the country, these treasures were hidden in a secret place. There were also the legendary secret books on the art of war. The ancestors of the previous dynasty were like gods when it came to war, but they weren't able to leave behind even a single book on the art of war. It was said that these were all hidden by the ancestors, waiting for their descendants to discover them. As long as they had these, how could they not succeed? Tan Jiji gritted his teeth and waved his hand, someone come, take Dr. Lin away. 2 men appeared at the door and took the order to drag Dr. Lin away. Yi Li frowned. Lord Tan, if you take Dr. Lin away, what will happen to me? Tan Jiji looked at her and said indifferently, Princess Ding, don't worry. Lin, and I also know a little about medicine. As long as we leave the northwest, this one will definitely find another famous doctor to take care of the princess. He's your father. Yi Li said in a low voice as she looked at the expressionless Dr. Lin. Shu Manlin snorted and said, what kind of father is he? He's just relying on the fact that he raised Jiji. Jiji is a descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family. He's just a servant of the imperial family. Jiji respects him because of his kindness in raising him. Does he really think he's someone to Jiji? Take him away. Seeing Dr. Lin being taken away, Yi Li closed her eyes in exhaustion. She looked at Tan Jiji and said in a low voice, you'll regret this. Tan Jiji snorted in disdain and said, Princess, rest well. We'll be on our way tomorrow morning. After he finished speaking, he hugged Shu Manlin and turned to leave. Shu Manlin turned around and gave Yi Li a provocative look. Yi Li glanced at her. She wasn't in the mood to pay attention to this boring woman. Late at night, a fast horse galloped into Ruyang City. The soldiers guarding the city walls immediately became vigilant. The people at the foot of the city walls seemed to be prepared. They casually threw something up. The soldiers guarding the city walls caught it and checked it over and over again. After that, they waved their hands and said, let them pass. A moment later, the city gates opened. The person on the horse didn't care about anything else. He pulled on the reins and rushed into the city. Chapter 400. In the city, where Qi Lin was stationed, Qin Feng, who was almost asleep when he was woken up by someone, looked a little gloomy. He quickly walked into the study and asked Mo Hua, who was waiting for him, it's so late. What's the matter? Mo Hua looked a little strange. After a moment of silence, she took out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Qin Feng, the shadow guard just came. Take a look. Qin Feng frowned. The paper in his hand was an extremely ordinary prescription. There was nothing wrong with the paper or the handwriting. He raised his head and asked, what's wrong with the prescription? Mo Hua said, this was sent by a spy of the Tianyi Pavilion. A few days ago, 2 men and a woman came to the small town. The woman is a few months pregnant and is staying in an inn in the town. That inn is the target of the Tianyi Pavilion's current surveillance. Yesterday, the people in the inn went to get the medicine. This is a prescription for pregnancy stabilizing. However, 2 of the medicines are obviously too heavy. The doctor in charge carefully read the prescription to be cautious. He found some strange pictures of himself on it, but they couldn't decipher it at all. Qin Feng's heart skipped a beat. He looked at Mo Hua excitedly. Mo Hua was silent. The 2 of them were silent for a moment. Qin Feng grabbed the prescription in his hand and looked at it slowly in front of the candlelight. 2 blurred lines of himself gradually appeared on the originally clean prescription. Although they were blurred, it didn't stop Qin Feng from looking at the familiar and special problem. He couldn't help but say excitedly, "Quick! Go see the prince. There's news of the princess consort. Prince, Commander Qin requests to see you." The guard outside the study reported respectfully. In the study, Mo Xiuyao, who was resting with his eyes closed, suddenly opened his eyes. There was no trace of sleepiness in his eyes. He said calmly, "Let him in." Not long after, Qin Feng rushed in with Mo Hua. He couldn't suppress the excitement on his face. Mo Xiuyao had always been very generous towards the people around Yili, otherwise, with his current temper, Han Mingxi would have already died. Therefore, he did not mind Qin Feng's rudeness. Frowning, he asked, "What's the matter?" Qin Feng could not restrain his excitement. In a loud voice he said, "Prince, there's news about Wang Fei." Mo Xiuyao stared blankly at the candlelight in front of him, as if he didn't understand what Qin Feng was saying. Qin Feng was a little anxious and repeated, "Prince, there's news of the princess consort." Mo Xiuyao finally came back to his senses. His half-closed eyes moved slightly. He said calmly, "Speak clearly." Qin Feng was puzzled by Mo Xiuyao's calm attitude. Mo Hua, who was standing behind him, could clearly see that Prince's clenched fingers on the table were trembling. She hurriedly stepped forward and recounted what had happened. Under Qin Feng's interrogation, although Su Zuodi had not revealed the entire truth, it was enough for them to know a lot about Tanjiji. Therefore, all of Tanjiji's strongholds in the northwest were naturally included in the Shadow Guard's knowledge. But they had not thought that the princess consort would fall into Tanjiji's hands. They had even appeared together in a small town not far from Ruyang. They had even successfully sent a secret letter to them. Mo Xiuyao took the prescription list. Qin Feng had written the password on it in a corner. Some strange symbols formed 2 lines of text. Mo Xiuyao had seen some of it in Qi Lin's files, but he had not studied it in detail. He turned his gaze to Qin Feng. Qin Feng finally calmed down, but his eyes still flashed with sharpness. "The princess consort says that everything is well. Please, Prince, do not worry." "Well, do not worry." Mo Xiuyao leaned back against the chair and closed his eyes. A long time later, he stood and ordered, "Send the order. Immediately go and welcome the princess consort back." "Prince." Mo Hua stepped forward and blocked Mo Xiuyao. He looked at him disapprovingly and said, "Prince, the princess consort can be welcomed by us. Prince, it is better for you to stay in Ruyang. Prince, today is the 15th. Qin Feng just remembered that today was the day of the full moon. The prince could not move as he pleased. He also quickly agreed, Commander Mo's words are reasonable. "Prince, this subordinate requests to go and welcome the princess consort back." Mo Hua stepped forward and said, "This subordinate is also willing to go." Mo Xiuyao waved his hand and said in a low voice, "Enough. I know what to do. Send the order. We will depart in 15 minutes. Qin Feng, bring some people and follow I." Although he was worried about Mo Xiuyao's health, he was overjoyed that Yili was safe. Qin Feng hesitated for a moment but still accepted the order and left. Outside the door, Zhuo Jing and the others who had rushed over after receiving the news were standing at the door. When they saw Qin Feng come out, they quickly went forward. Qin Feng nodded to the three of them and hurriedly left to handle the matter. Zhuo Jing and the others were also stunned. Their eyes shone with ecstasy. Lin Han's eyes could not help but turn red. However, he did not care. His face was full of joy that had not been seen for a long time. Early in the morning, Yili got up early to tidy up. Actually, Yili did not sleep well the entire night. Ever since Dr. Lin was taken away by Tan Jiji, Yili did not hear any sound of him returning. Although she had only known Tan Jiji for a few days, it was enough for Yili to understand how cruel this man's heart was. This caused Yili to worry about the old man who had saved her and her child's life. After sitting in the parlor for a while, Tan Jiji walked in with Yili. Seeing that Yili seemed to be tired, he could not help but smile and say, "What is it? Princess Ding did not rest well last night. We are about to leave Ruyang. Wang Fei is reluctant to leave." Yili frowned and asked, "How is Dr. Lin?" Tan Jiji was slightly surprised. He looked at Yili and said with a smile, "So Wang Fei is worried about him. Don't tell me that Princess Consort really has the so-called master-disciple relationship with my father?" Yili looked at him calmly and said, "Although it has not been long, it is a fact that Dr. Lin has taught me medicine. Even if it is feelings of master and disciple, what is wrong with that?" Tan Jiji looked at Yili with a strange and mocking expression. He raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "Speaking of which, Wang Fei really does not seem like someone from the imperial house. Right now, you can't even protect yourself, but Wang Fei still has the mood to care about someone you have just met?" Yili sneered indifferently, "Lord Tan, you can even give up the kindness of raising me for more than 20 years without batting an eye. You are indeed more like a member of the royal family than I am. You are indeed a descendant of the previous dynasty." Yili's words hit Tan Jiji's sore spot. His expression instantly became ugly. He said coldly, "Since Wang Fei is ready, let us depart." "Tan Darren, please," Yili said faintly. Leaving the inn, even though there was only Yili, Tan Jiji, and Shu Manlin with 3 or 4 servants, Yili was sensitive enough to feel that there were eyes following them from the shadows. Even though she had been restricted to the yard and could not go out these past few days, Yili estimated that there were at least 10 people hiding in the innermost yard where she and Dr. Lin lived. Not to mention other places. If the secret guards rushed in a moment of impatience, it would be bad for them to be in such a small courtyard. Standing outside the door of the inn, Yili turned back to look at the deserted and old inn. She still did not see any trace of Dr. Lin. Tan Jiji had not obtained the treasure he wanted, so he probably would not kill Dr. Lin. Yili could only hope in her heart. Chapter 401. As expected, the Mahist army passed by the town from time to time. They walked side by side in pairs. They didn't look like they were looking for someone, but more like they were patrolling. Tan Jiji also noticed this situation. He frowned and waved for Shu Manlin to help Yili onto the carriage by the side of the road. After a while, the slow carriage slowly moved out of the town. Shu Manlin sat opposite Yili and stared at her with an unfriendly expression. Although Shu Manlin often came to the small courtyard to bully Yili, Dr. Lin was usually present. This was the first time the two were alone together. Yili looked calmly at the beautiful woman opposite her and smiled faintly. Shu Manlin raised her eyebrows and snorted disdainfully. She stared at Yili and said, "Do you know who I am?" Yili lowered her eyes. "I don't want to know who you are at all." "Miss Lin, if you don't know who you are, how would I know?" Shu Manlin glanced at her arrogantly and said, "You don't have to pretend. I know you've already guessed my identity. Princess Ding, when you were in Nanzhao, you used the identity of Su Qingqian's fiancé to deceive me and that idiot Anxi. Do you think I won't guard against you?" Yili looked up at her and smiled, then. Holy maiden, do you have any advice for me? Compared to the young Princess Anshi, who ruled the country well, Yili couldn't see how Shu Manlin had the right to call her an idiot. She was indeed an idiot. Did she always think that others were idiots? You know what I want to say. If you know what's good for you, then obediently shut your mouth. Otherwise, don't blame me for being rude. Shu Manlin threatened in a low voice. Yili raised her eyebrows. Of course, she knew what she was talking about. So she was pestering Big Brother behind Tan Jiji's back. However, Yili was surprised that Shu Manlin was afraid of Tan Jiji. After all, in anyone's eyes, even if Tan Jiji was a descendant of the previous dynasty's royal family, he was now just an emperor's personal attendant. He had no money, no power, and no one. On the other hand, Shu Manlin was the saintess of the southern border. Her status and power were almost on par with the southern border king's crown princess. Furthermore, she had the secret support of the southern border king and Mo Jingli. Even if they were hooking up, it should be Tan Jiji who gave in to Shu Manlin. It seemed that she had underestimated Tan Jiji because of his performance in the imperial mausoleum. Yili tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then she smiled and said, Saintess, you should know that I'm not the kind of person who likes to gossip. Shu Manlin sneered, it's good that you know what's good for you. Otherwise, I have plenty of ways to shut you up. Quietly looking at Shu Manlin, Yili's lips revealed a cold smile. Saintess, your words make this consort very uncomfortable. Now, do you dare to kill me? No, do you dare to attack me now? Shu Manlin's pretty face sank. That's right, in the past few days, Tan Jiji had repeatedly warned her not to touch Yili. Although she was unhappy, she wasn't the kind of woman who couldn't see the big picture. Since they didn't get the previous dynasty's treasure, the importance of Princess Ding as a bargaining chip became even more apparent. Now, not only could they not harm Yili, they even had to protect her. As long as they could safely bring Yili out of the Mahist army's sphere of influence, they would have two bargaining chips that they could use to threaten Mo Xiuyao at any time. Yili, don't be too complacent. One day. Shu Manlin gritted her teeth and said in a low voice. One day, the bargaining chip would lose its effectiveness. In the future, she could torture the woman in front of her however she wanted. Thinking back to last year when Yili caused a ruckus in Nanzhao and what she did in Shattered Snow Pass, her original plan was almost completely destroyed. Whenever she thought of this, Shu Manlin couldn't help but want to skin her alive. Not to mention, she was Su Qingqian's cousin. Yili supported her head with her hand and leisurely reminded her, Saintess, you should think about the present first. Who knows what will happen in the future? Of course, if you don't mind, I don't mind occasionally chatting with official Tan about what happened in Nanjiang. Something that the Saintess of Nanjiang and Gongzi Qingqian have to talk about. Shu Manlin's face turned green with anger. She raised her hand and wanted to slap Yili's face, but Yili was faster than her. Ah! Outside the carriage, Tan Jiji, who was riding a horse, quickly caught up a few steps. He leaned over and lifted the curtain beside the carriage and saw Shu Manlin's raised hand. He frowned unhappily and said, Lin, what are you doing? I said before, you can't be rude to the princess. Shu Manlin angrily put down her hand and cast a sharp look at Yili. She muttered in a low voice, I know. Tan Jiji looked at the two with some worry and said, we're about to leave the town. Don't make trouble. Then he put down the curtain. Yili smiled at Shu Manlin and raised her eyebrows. Shu Manlin gritted her teeth, Yili, just you wait. The carriage was stopped at the exit of the town. Fortunately, the people who stopped the inspection at the intersection were not the Mahist army, but ordinary Yamen runners. This made Tan Jiji breathe a sigh of relief. Who is on the carriage? Get off! The Yamen runner who was outside the carriage shouted in a deep voice. Tan Jiji put on a disguise and looked honest and scholarly. He went forward and said, Official, what's going on? The Yamen runner knocked on the carriage door and said, under orders from above, we're searching for spies in the northwest. As long as it's a foreigner, we'll check all of them. Let the people inside come out. Tan Jiji looked embarrassed as he said, "Official, please forgive me. My family's wife is 7 months pregnant. It's really inconvenient. Please be magnanimous and forgive me." As he said that, he slipped 2 ingots of silver to the official without leaving a trace. He had completely put on the appearance of a cowardly scholar. The yamen runner got the benefit. He looked at each other and said, "It's okay if you don't get off the carriage. Lift the curtain and take a look." As he said this, he didn't care if Tan Jiji agreed or not. He went forward and lifted the curtain. He saw 2 young women sitting in the carriage. One of them had a young woman's hairstyle. Sure enough, she had a big belly. The other woman in blue was beautiful and moving. She smiled at him. The yamen runner was stunned and muttered in a low voice, "It's really a good fortune. In such a small place, there's actually such a beauty." Tan Jiji smiled carefully and said, "Official, can this young man leave now?" The yamen runner looked inside with some reluctance. Then he put down the curtain and waved his hand, "Go, go." "Thank you, official, thank you," Tan Jiji said happily. He quickly waved his hand and let the coachman drive the carriage out of the town. Once the carriage was out of sight, the arrogance on the faces of the bailiffs outside the town gradually faded. One of them asked, "How was it? Did you see it clearly?" The yamen runner who lifted the curtain to check frowned and said, "It's the princess consort." The princess consort said that the other party has a lot of people and there are people from Nanjiang. She told us to stay calm. Damn it. Seeing the princess consort pass by, the man next to him cursed in a low voice. His companion patted him on the shoulder and said, "Since he's been targeted by us, does he still want to take the princess consort and leave the northwest? This is indeed not the place to make a move. Now that the princess consort is pregnant, it's inconvenient for her to move. The woman in the carriage is also not a good person. What if she hurts the princess consort?" Chapter 402. Leaving the small town, Tan Jiji clearly felt uneasy. He ordered people to speed up and rush to Feihong Pass without stopping. According to his original plan, there shouldn't have been any problems. He had been hiding between the Dechu state and Nanzhao for almost 10 years and hadn't attracted the attention of any of the nobles, including the Prince Ding mansion. And he hadn't entered the northwest from Feihong Pass. Logically speaking, he shouldn't have attracted Mo Xiuyao's attention. But the sudden appearance of the patrolling troops in the small town made him feel that he had lost control of something. Just as he was puzzled, he suddenly thought of a person. He couldn't help but inwardly suck in a cold breath. He only hoped that woman wouldn't be so stupid as to reveal everything about him. A murderous intent flashed through his eyes. It shouldn't be. That woman should know that once she said it, she would die. Mo Xiuyao would definitely cut her to pieces. "Jiji, rest for a while, I'm tired." Shu Manlin lifted the curtain and said with an ugly expression. She had been spoiled since she was young. How could she bear the pain of the bumpy carriage? She couldn't stand it anymore. Adding on Yi Li's occasional sarcastic remarks, Shu Manlin, who had endured for a long time, finally couldn't hold it in anymore. Tan Jiji glanced at her. Her expression was ugly. He remembered that Yi Li was still pregnant and couldn't be too bumpy. After hesitating, he nodded and said, "Rest for an hour." Shu Manlin happily called out that Jiji was great. Then she jumped off the carriage, wanting to stretch her muscles. Tan Jiji raised an eyebrow and looked at Yi Li in the carriage. "Wang Fei, do you want to come down for a walk?" Yi Li's face was pale. Adding on the fact that she hadn't slept well, she looked even more tired. She shook her head and said, "Since we've stopped, I'll sleep for a while. Don't disturb me." Tan Jiji didn't care. He naturally hoped that Yi Li had fewer things to do. Without waiting for him to say anything, Shu Manlin had already pulled him to the foot of a tree. Gigi, go sit for a while and rest. It's so hot. I'm so tired. Tan Gigi was clearly very patient with her. He said in a low voice, since it's like this, you can also lean on me and sleep for a while. My successor is the best. In the afternoon, the horses grazed quietly in the woods. Under the shade of the tree, a pair of lovers sat together and rested. It was a quiet and peaceful picture. When Tan Gigi realized that something was wrong, he raised his head abruptly and suddenly realized that the silence in the forest was too strange. Unknowingly, a green-robed man appeared at the foot of a tree not far away. His black hair was like the clouds, and the silver dragon pattern on his green robe flickered luxuriously under the setting sun. The man's figure was thin, and his handsome face was covered with a silver half-mask, but it still couldn't hide the sickly paleness on his face. However, even if he just stood there quietly and raised his head slightly to look in their direction, he inadvertently revealed a natural noble aura that made people feel ashamed of their inferiority. But at this moment, what made Tan Gigi feel a chill in his heart was that no one in the forest, including the guard standing guard not far away, seemed to have seen the man at all. It was as if the overwhelming pressure he felt was a figment of his imagination. Mo Xiaoyao. Tan Gigi said in a deep voice, but he completely ignored the pressure on his body, and desperately flew towards the carriage not far away. The guards on the side seemed to have just realized that an unfamiliar man had appeared in the forest and hurriedly pulled out their weapons to meet him. Under the tree, the green-robed man frowned slightly. Clearly, he was very dissatisfied with the situation in front of him. He took a step forward and passed through the guards like a flowing cloud. His wide sleeves carried a bewitching bloody light as he also headed for the carriage. He stood farther than Tan Gigi, and his movements seemed slower than Tan Gigi's, but he hadn't arrived much later than Tan Gigi. Just as Tan Gigi reached out to grab the curtain of the carriage, a silver light flashed and a cold silver radiance slashed towards his hand that was reaching towards the carriage. Tan Gigi gritted his teeth. Mo Xiaoyao. At this moment, he didn't have the energy to think about why Mo Xiaoyao would appear here. The only thing he could think of was to defeat the man in front of him. However, this was extremely difficult. Mo Xiaoyao was known as one of the 4 great experts in the world. Today, Mu Qingcang had always been known as the true number 1 expert in the Chu state. After his attack failed, Tan Gigi flew back and roared, "Release the arrows." The forest was quiet, but there wasn't the expected sound of arrows piercing through the air. Tan Gigi's expression changed slightly. He stared closely at the green-robed man in front of him. However, he saw that Mo Xiaoyao didn't even look at him. He turned around and lifted the curtain of the carriage behind him. He looked at the woman in the carriage with a gentle and warm smile. "Li, I've come to take you home." Xiaoyao. In the carriage, Yi Li stared blankly at the green-robed man who was smiling and reaching his hand out to her. The faint setting sun shone through the forest and onto his body. Through the faint light, Yi Li could clearly see that his face was even paler and thinner than before. She didn't know why, but Yi Li felt her heart ache. Before she could stop it, sparkling tears had already fallen from the corners of her eyes. Looking at the graceful woman in the carriage, his gaze fell to the tears falling from the corners of her eyes. Mo Xiaoyao's gaze suddenly became a bit panicked, but he still stubbornly reached his hand out to Yi Li. "Li. Is Li blaming Xiaoyao for coming too late?" Yi Li's eyelids trembled slightly. Only then did she realize that she had already shed tears. She quickly wiped them away and reached out to the man outside the carriage. Mo Xiaoyao carefully carried her off the carriage, but he was unwilling to let go. It was as if the person in his arms would disappear as soon as he let go. Raising his hand, he gently lifted Yi Li's disguised face. It was still gentle and beautiful, but it was a bit different from her usual elegant face. Mo Xiaoyao took out a handkerchief from his chest and carefully wiped away the makeup that was covering her elegant face, revealing the originally familiar and beautiful face. Li. Looking at the person in his arms, Mo Xiaoyao's eyes were filled with gentleness and love. Li. I will never let you leave me again. Yi Li raised her head and was immediately met with those gentle and loving eyes. She suddenly felt that the cautiousness she had these days had disappeared without a trace. She just wanted to rest quietly in the man's arms. Gently nodding, she said, we will never be separated again. Yi Li sighed softly. Mo Xiaoyao's eyes lit up and he carefully held her in his arms. His handsome chin rubbed against her slender shoulder as he smiled and said, all right, it's a promise. We will never be separated again. Tan Jiji, who had been ignored, stared at the arrogant man and woman in front of him with an ugly expression. But when his gaze fell on the bodies of the guards who had fallen not far away, the anger in his eyes was quickly suppressed by him. The guards who had been secretly following them had not reacted yet. It was obvious that they had been controlled or eliminated before they had noticed. And just now, Mo Xiaoyao had arrived first, and even effortlessly got rid of several guards who were blocking his way. Just this skill alone was enough to make him arrogant. Tan Jiji had never underestimated Mo Xiaoyao and Dinggua manner. Otherwise, he would not have carefully hidden behind Mo Jingqi for so many years and secretly manipulated everything, because he knew that once he exposed himself, what awaited him would be a fatal blow from Mo Xiaoyao. Chapter 403. Su Zuodi, this slut. At this point, he was even calmer. Whether he was willing or not, he had to admit that Su Zuodi had betrayed him. Behind his back, Tan Jiji clenched his fists tightly, thinking quickly about how to escape. This subordinate greets His Highness and Her Highness. After Qin Feng and the others dealt with the guards that Tan Jiji had secretly arranged, they waited in the dark for a long time, but they still didn't see the prince and princess consort summons. They couldn't bear it anymore and had to show themselves. Moreover, as they wished, they received a sharp glare from Mo Xiaoyao. Subordinate greets prince and princess. There were many people scattered in the forest, and they all saluted the two people. They seemed to be standing casually, but they completely blocked Tan Jiji's escape route. Seeing this, Tan Jiji's face changed, and finally calmed down. Taking a step forward, Tan Jiji smiled and said, "Subordinate greets Prince Ding." Mo Xiaoyao seemed to have just noticed that there were outsiders here, and gave him a little bit of attention. Glancing at Tan Jiji who bowed, Mo Xiaoyao asked faintly, "Lord Tan, where do you want to take Ai's princess?" Tan Jiji's heart sank, and he couldn't decide whether he should take a gamble or not. If he won the gamble, maybe he had a chance to leave here safely, but if he lost, no, if he didn't take this gamble, he wouldn't be able to leave here alive today. And looking at Prince Ding's expression, it didn't seem like he knew about that matter. Soon, Tan Jiji had made up his mind, and he cupped his hands and smiled apologetically. It was indeed a moment of greed that made a mistake. Since Prince is already here, this subordinate also congratulates Prince and Princess for a family reunion. Today's matter. I ask for Prince's forgiveness. Forgiveness? Mo Xiaoyao's smile was very faint, but it made people feel cold in their hearts. Nodding slightly, he said, "I remember that Lord Tan almost took away Ai's beloved princess, and I'm in a bad mood. If Lord Tan is hurt in any way, please forgive me, Lord Tan." After saying that, he seemed to have lost all interest in Tan Jiji. He waved his hand and said, "Take him away and kill him." Tan Jiji's heart tightened. He hadn't expected Mo Xiaoyao to be so decisive. A thought flashed through his mind, and he said, "Prince Ding, don't you want to know what His Majesty thinks?" Mo Xiaoyao sneered, and lightly spat out a few words, "Qin Feng, kill." With that, he bent down and carefully carried Yi Li, and turned to leave. Yi Li fidgeted uncomfortably as she was picked up in front of so many people. Mo Xiaoyao smiled faintly and said, "Li, don't move." Yili frowned slightly, faintly feeling that there was something wrong with Mo Xiaoyao, but she couldn't tell what it was. But when she met his gentle eyes, she didn't know why, but she couldn't say anything. She could only let him hold her. Tan Jiji saw that he was about to leave, and knew that once Mo Xiaoyao and Yili left, he would die. Looking at Yili, who was in Mo Xiaoyao's arms, Tan Jiji suddenly said, "Princess, don't you want to know how to cure Prince Ding's poison?" Yili was startled, but Mo Xiaoyao didn't seem to care, and walked out of the forest. Tan Jiji said loudly, "Princess, do you really not want to know where the falling jade flower is? Or do you think that the ice-fire lotus can cure Prince Ding's poison?" Not many people knew that Princess Ding was secretly looking for the falling jade flower, and that she had a grudge with the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce's third master. Yili was startled, and said, "Qin Feng, take him back." Mo Xiaoyao snorted, but didn't refute Yili's words. He carried her and walked out of the forest without looking back. Qin Feng and the others who were left behind watched Mo Xiaoyao's departing figure with ugly expressions. They hadn't even been able to say a word to Princess before they were taken away by Prince. But these days, they had been in an extremely delicate and dangerous atmosphere, and no one had the guts to stop Mo Xiaoyao and say anything important or unimportant. Waving his hand, he had people take Tan Jiji and Shu Manlin away. Qin Feng looked at Mo Hua, who was standing to the side with a hesitant expression, and asked, "What's wrong?" Mo Hua said in a low voice, "Prince's body." Today was the day of the full moon, and in the past few months, Prince's illness had been acting up more and more seriously. Last month, on the day of the full moon, it started acting up at noon. According to Shen Yang's guess, Prince was definitely not feeling well now. But now, Qin Feng looked in the direction that Mo Xiaoyao had left in, and hesitated for a moment before saying, "It should be fine, right?" When it acted up, there was nothing else but pain. With Prince's willpower, there was basically no danger to his life. Moreover, any medicine was useless, so it didn't matter where Prince was now. The most important thing was that no one dared to disturb him now. "I'll get people to protect Prince and Princess's safety." Mo Hua nodded. Although this was originally the responsibility of the Shadow Guard, Mo Hua also admitted that Qi Lin was better than the Shadow Guard. Leaning in Mo Xiaoyao's arms, Yili suddenly felt a sense of peace that she had never felt before. These days, although she appeared calm and composed on the surface, it was very inconvenient for her to move around after being pregnant for a few months. How could her heart really be at ease? Especially when he was with Tan Jiji, every casual joke he made was carefully calculated and considered. Now that she was completely relaxed, a wave of sleepiness suddenly surged up. Leaning against Mo Xiaoyao's chest, she felt a little drowsy. "Xiaoyao, where are we going?" Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head to look at her half-closed eyes and smiled gently, "Sleep if you're tired." Yili shook her head, forcing herself to open her eyes and look at the road ahead that was getting more and more secluded. As long as one paid attention, they would notice that even Mo Xiaoyao himself did not have a fixed destination. He was just picking a secluded path and walking forward. Yili did not know where Mo Xiaoyao wanted to take her, but she could feel the rare stubbornness and determination in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes. Sighing softly, she said, "Xiaoyao, I'm a little tired. Let's rest for a while before we continue, okay?" "Tired?" Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head to look at her. As expected, he found that there was an unconcealable tiredness on her thin face, and there were faint shadows under her eyes. Looking around, Mo Xiaoyao tapped his foot and took Yili into the air. Stepping over the treetops on the side of the road, they flew towards the road on the opposite side of the mountain. Behind them, Qin Feng, who had silently followed, pulled back Mo Hua, who was about to use Qinggong to fly over. Mo Hua turned back to glare at him in dissatisfaction. Qin Feng shrugged, "Can't you see that the prince wants to avoid us, so he keeps walking forward? If we follow, the prince will still have to walk forward." Mo Hua silently stopped, Frowning, the prince and Wang Fei's safety, Qin Feng rolled his eyes at the sky. He picked a flat stone to sit down on. The Mahist army is at the foot of the mountain, and the Shadow Guard and Qi Lin are in the middle. If assassins sneak in, we don't need to live. Let's jump down from here. Mo Hua was silent for a moment and then silently sat down on the stone at the side. Qin Feng propped himself up on the stone and looked at the blue sky. He sighed in a good mood, so blue. Chapter 404. Mo Xiaoyao turned around to look at the other side. He hugged Yili and turned into an even more secluded path. Very quickly, he found a secluded and flat area. He hugged Yili and sat down. Only then did he smile at her and say, "We finally got rid of them." Yili was speechless. She finally understood what she thought was wrong. She had never seen Mo Xiaoyao like this before. In the past, Mo Xiaoyao would occasionally tease her. After he succeeded, he would proudly smile at her. But that smile was always gentle and confident. Even if it was gentle, it still made people feel strong and at ease. But now, Mo Xiaoyao's proud smile had a trace of willfulness and recklessness. "Xiaoyao, what's wrong?" Yili frowned. She raised her hand to touch his pale face. "Sorry, I made you worry." Mo Xiaoyao buried his face in her hair and said in a muffled voice, "Li, I want to kill them." Yili was stunned. "Them? Who?" "Everyone." Mo Xiaoyao's voice was filled with killing intent. He tightly wrapped Yili in his arms and said, "Kill everyone, those who hurt Li, they all deserve to die. And those eyesores, I only want Li, everyone else can die." Yili's heart trembled. She slightly pushed Mo Xiaoyao away with trembling hands. She lifted his face that was buried in her hair and looked at Mo Xiaoyao's face that was still filled with killing intent and ruthlessness. Mo Xiaoyao also saw his own appearance in her eyes. The gentleness that he once pretended to be was completely gone. Actually, Mo Xiaoyao had never been truly gentle, and he had never felt that there was anything wrong with it. However, in Yili's eyes, he was undoubtedly ugly. His mask was easily removed by Yili, revealing the hideous scar on the left side of his face and the remaining murderous aura on his face. He didn't look like the gentle and cold prince that people usually thought of. Instead, he looked more like a life-reaping Azura from hell. "Li, are you afraid of me?" Mo Xiaoyao stared at the woman in his arms. His voice was filled with a trace of grievance and fragility, but the arrogance on his face only grew stronger. His gentleness, indifference, and wisdom had always been a pretense. The real Mo Xiaoyao had always been someone who made a clear distinction between love and hate, and acted recklessly. The Mo Xiaoyao of the past rode his horse around the capital in high spirits, using the long whip in his hand to punish the hedonistic scoundrels, and above, to punish the descendants of the imperial family. The treasured sword in his hand would slay gods and Buddhas if they tried to stop him. But the current Mo Xiaoyao, without that pretense, was covered in wounds and his heart was filled with resentment and killing intent. He was no longer the fiery and bright youth from before. He didn't know if he should be happy that Li hadn't seen his former high spirits, or if he should hate himself for only being able to give her this imperfect version of himself. "Li. What nonsense are you saying?" Yili sighed. She sat up and gently placed a kiss on his lips. She didn't know how the man in front of her had spent these past few months, but she clearly knew that his worry, pain, and resentment were all because of her. Hugging his neck, Yili seriously looked at him and said in a low voice, "Xiaoyao, no matter what happens, I won't leave you. Here." She gently placed his hand on her round belly and said in a soft voice, "There is already our baby here. Xiaoyao, very soon, we will have a complete home." Mo Xiaoyao was stunned. In fact, from the very beginning, he hadn't noticed the child at all. Fortunately, he was too careful when holding Yili, so he didn't hurt the child. He stared blankly at his hand's already very big belly and felt the gentle movements of his hand from time to time. Mo Xiaoyao frowned. He once again held Yili in his arms and said unhappily, I hate children. Li, I only want you. Yili blinked. Looking at the man in front of her who was acting like a child, she couldn't say a single word of anger. Mo Xiaoyao never hated children. When they were in love, he had also looked forward to the arrival of a child. Very quickly, Yili understood why he had such a reaction. It was because she was pregnant and couldn't move freely, which caused them to retreat slowly. Mo Xiaoyao blamed her falling off the cliff on the child. She helplessly comforted the man who rarely threw a tantrum. I love him. He is our child. Mo Xiaoyao's body slightly stiffened. He raised his head again and stared at her. Yili looked at him with a puzzled expression and softly said, What's wrong? Mo Xiaoyao pursed his lips and didn't say anything. He just stared at her without letting go. Yili helplessly sighed. It was hard to guess the thoughts of a man who was throwing a tantrum. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her for a long time. His gaze moved to that round belly, and his eyes were filled with anger and jealousy. Yili was stunned. Thinking back to what she had just said, she couldn't help but smile. She reached out and raised Mo Xiaoyao's face to face her. Yili softly smiled and whispered in his ear, Xiaoyao, I love the baby because I love his father more, do you understand? In an instant, it was as if spring had returned to the earth. His originally gloomy eyes were filled with gentle starlight. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head and fiercely kissed those sweet lips. He had never felt that there were such moving words in the world. He couldn't help but want to drown in them and never wake up. Li, I love you. Mo Xiaoyao will only love Li alone in this life. Yili raised her hand and hugged his shoulder. She responded to this long-awaited kiss. I know. I also, under the evening sun, on the quiet hillside, the two people who had been separated for a long time exchanged their love and longing for each other. Their lips and tongues intertwined, and their breaths became one. Mo Xiaoyao tightly held the gentle woman in front of him in his arms. Li, no one can take you away from me, Xiaoyao. The evening breeze gently blew, bringing a trace of coolness to the hot summer day. Yili opened her eyes and looked at the man who was hugging her and sleeping soundly on the hillside. She couldn't help but smile. They were both too tired. Two adults sitting here actually fell asleep without any warning. If their enemies knew about this, who knew how they would wring their hands and sigh. As soon as she moved, Mo Xiaoyao immediately opened his eyes. Li. Yili comforted him with a faint smile. It's okay. If you're tired, then rest for a while. We'll go back later. Since it was already so late, it didn't matter if it was a little later. Mo Xiaoyao still frowned even in his deep sleep. Yili's heart ached slightly. Mo Xiaoyao closed his eyes again. He buried his face in Yili's arms and breathed in the familiar fragrance. His furrowed brows gradually relaxed. The familiar pain gradually spread from his leg to his entire body, but he didn't want to pay attention to it. Only after a few months did he realize that the monthly pain was nothing at all. Sometimes, he even looked forward to that kind of pain. Because only when he was in that kind of intense pain could he ignore the endless darkness and coldness in his heart. Only then could he suppress the crazy thoughts that wanted to destroy everything in his heart. Right now, it was very good. Yili lowered her head and gently flicked the leaves that fell on his shoulder. The afterglow of the setting sun shone on his black hair. Yili's hand paused for a moment, and her fingertips trembled slightly. She carefully touched his hair, and a wisp of gray leaked out from his jet black hair. She raised her hand and gently stroked his hair. Her fingers were gradually dyed with a faint black color. Suddenly, her beautiful eyes were filled with tears, like a broken string of pearls sliding down her cheeks. Chapter 405. Li. Mo Xiaoyao called softly. It's fine, sleep. The wind is very comfortable, Yili said with a light smile. Drops of glistening tears fell silently and soaked the back of her hand. Ryang City was filled with joy. The reason was that Princess Ding, who had been missing for more than half a year, had returned safely. Not only had Princess Ding returned safely, even the 7-month pregnant little Shitzi was also safe in Princess Ding's belly. All of Ryang City was bustling as though it was a festival. Everyone knew that Wang Fei, as a woman, had led an army of 200,000 to fight against Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling and had almost wiped out Genom of Gojoseon's army. Now that Wang Fei and the little Shitzi had returned safely, wasn't the heavens protecting His Highness Prince Ding? In this kind of chaotic world, the common people rarely had the time to pay attention to the teachings of the saints. Whoever gave them a peaceful life, they would love and support that person. Now that the Dechu state was in chaos, the Northwest, which had been the first to experience the chaos of war, had become a place of peace. Most of this was due to the efforts of Wang Fei. Thus, Princess Ding's return naturally made the people happy. At the same time, it gave them more confidence in the future of the Northwest. Amidst the celebration, the governor's fu in the center of the city was still silent. Even though everyone's faces were filled with joy, this was still not the time to celebrate. In the bedroom, Yili sat by the bed and looked at the pale-faced man who had fallen into a deep sleep. She felt waves of pain in her heart. Shen Yang carefully removed the silver needles from Mo Xiaoyao's body and retreated to the side to wash his hands. Yili asked worriedly, Mr. Shen, how is Xiaoyao? In the afternoon, Yili had jumped in fright. Mo Xiaoyao, who had been fine, had suddenly fainted and even showed signs of bleeding from his 7 orifices. Shen Yang looked at Yili and comforted her, Wang Fei, don't worry. The prince is fine for now. It's all because of me that I forgot today's date. How could Prince? Yili had been in the mountains for a few months, and there had been no sun or moon for a few days in the imperial mausoleum, so she had forgotten the time. She didn't expect today to be the day of the full moon. Shen Yang said, Prince only used the pulse-cutting technique to seal off the pain. However, the pain during the full moon was not something that could be suppressed. Prince forced himself to do so, so naturally, he couldn't avoid some internal injuries. Fortunately, we discovered it early, so it's not a big deal. Yili frowned and said, I've seen Xiao Yao's appearance when he flares up, but it's different this time. Mr. Shen, did something happen to Xiao Yao? Please tell me the truth. Shen Yang sat down opposite her and said, Princess, please calm down. These few months, Prince has been much calmer. It's not because the degree of the poison has weakened, but because Prince's endurance seems to have reached a higher level. Or it can be said that Prince's pain seems to have become somewhat duller. Fortunately, in this one's opinion, Prince doesn't have any other problems. This can be considered a good thing. Now that Princess has returned safely, this one can focus on researching the poison in Prince's body without worry. There were too many people who had suffered in these few months, and Shen Yang was one of them. He couldn't lock himself in a quiet place to research medicine like he usually did, and he couldn't go out to search for precious herbs or seek out medical experts. Because he had to pay attention to Mo Xiaoyao's situation at all times to prevent any accidents from happening. However, looking at Mo Xiaoyao's appearance, even if Shen Yang had secretly adjusted Mo Xiaoyao's diet countless times, if it continued like this, Shen Yang dared to conclude that even if the poison in his body was cured, Prince would not live for more than 3 years. He would die of exhaustion. Now that Princess had returned, with her watching over Prince, it would be much easier to handle things. Yili nodded. She lowered her head to look at the sleeping face of the man on the bed. A trace of guilt and heartache flashed through her eyes. Many thanks, Mr. Shen. Go and rest. I'll watch over Prince here. Shen Yang stood and raised his hands, saying, Princess's body is not well right now. You should find some rest. If there's anything, just have someone call this one. After sending Shenyang away, she waved away the servants in front of her. Yili sat by the bed and silently looked at Mo Xiuyao's pale and handsome face. Her hand lightly brushed the long scar on the left side of his face. She sighed slightly. Xiuyao, in the morning, when Yili woke up, she found herself in a slightly warm embrace. She couldn't help but start and raise her head to look at the bed not far away. Because she didn't want to wake Mo Xiuyao, she had slept on a soft bed in the room last night. She hadn't thought that when she opened her eyes again, she would be in Mo Xiuyao's embrace. When she moved, Mo Xiuyao immediately opened his eyes. He didn't speak and just silently looked at Yili. Yili gave a faint smile. Are you better? Mo Xiuyao's eyes were bright. He rubbed against Yili's shoulder and pulled her into his embrace, saying, It hurts, I need to sleep a bit more. Yili raised a hand to gently brush away the hair on his face. Her heart was filled with bitterness. How could he sleep when his entire body was in pain? But she wasn't willing to refute his words. She nodded and said softly, All right, sleep a bit more. Yili, sleep with me, Mo Xiuyao said with his eyes closed. Yili replied, Let's sleep. However, they wanted to laze in bed for a while, but the others weren't willing to give them this opportunity. Not long after, the outside of the courtyard became noisy. Yili could faintly hear the voices of Han Mingxi and the others. When they returned last night, it was already night time. Because Mo Xiuyao was still unconscious, they only called for Shenyang to treat him. They didn't see anyone else. It was no wonder that Han Mingxi and the others came to make a ruckus early in the morning. Yili sat up helplessly. Before she could say anything, Mo Xiuyao also sat up. However, her face was so gloomy that it was frightening. They didn't summon any servant girls to serve them. The two of them slowly tidied up. By the time they left, the outside was already noisy. However, the shadow guard was very diligent in blocking the entrance. No matter how anxious the people outside were, they couldn't enter. Looking at the angry Han Mingxi standing at the entrance of the courtyard, Yili smiled faintly and said, Mingxi, I heard your voice early in the morning. What are you making a ruckus about? Suddenly hearing Yili's voice, Han Mingxi was startled. He quickly turned his head and saw the girl in green standing at the entrance smiling faintly. He couldn't help but reveal a look of ecstasy. Junwei. For a moment, Han Mingxi didn't care about anything else. He rushed towards Yili. However, although Han Mingxi's qinggong was known as the best, there was someone faster than him. Mo Xiuyao, who was beside Yili, didn't give him a chance to get close. He blocked Yili behind him and mercilessly sent a palm strike towards Han Mingxi. Han Mingxi jumped in fright. He flipped in midair and retreated a dozen steps to avoid the palm strike. Mo Xiuyao, you lunatic, what are you doing? The people around couldn't help but secretly sweat for Han Mingxi because they could clearly see how scary the man in front of them was. Mo Xiuyao didn't say a word. He moved forward and sent a few palm strikes towards Han Mingxi. Han Mingxi's martial arts were mediocre to begin with. How could he be a match for Mo Xiuyao? He immediately scrambled to dodge. Fortunately, his qinggong was the best in Jianghu. Otherwise, with the strength and ferocity of Mo Xiuyao's palms, it was hard to say what the consequences would be. Chapter 406. Xiuyao, what are you doing? Yili sighed helplessly. Was this considered being angry after waking up? In the past, she didn't realize that Mo Xiuyao would directly attack without saying a word. Mo Xiuyao's body paused. He raised his eyes to look at Han Mingxi, who didn't dare to come down from the treetops. He said coldly, Han Mingxi, I said before, be careful of your little life. Han Mingxi's heart jumped. Everyone else was standing behind Mo Xiuyao and didn't know, but he saw everything clearly. Mo Xiuyao's eyes flashed with genuine murderous intent as he stared at her. Just now, Mo Xiaoyao wasn't venting his anger on him. He really wanted to kill him. Alright, Yili slowly walked to Mo Xiaoyao's side and pulled down his hand to hold it tightly. She had been a sniper in her previous life and was very sensitive to the environment and atmosphere. How could she not detect the murderous intent in Mo Xiaoyao's words? She patted the back of Mo Xiaoyao's hand comfortingly. Feeling him relax, she raised her head to smile at Han Mingxi and said, "Mingxi, long time no see. What are you guys doing so early in the morning?" Han Mingxi rubbed his hair and grimaced, "Apologies, I heard that Wang Fei had returned yesterday, but it's so late." Yili nodded apologetically and said, "His Highness and I are late and have kept everyone waiting." Only then did the people present come back to their senses and said in unison, "This subordinate greets His Highness and Princess." Even though the court had already announced that Mo Xiaoyao's title had been stripped, in Ruyang City, not in the entire northwest region, the people seemed to have the same goal as they looked at the imperial edict. They still called Mo Xiaoyao Prince and Yili Wang Fei. Mo Xiaoyao didn't have any objections to this. If he didn't want to be prince, he would have to go through the trouble of thinking of a new title. Besides, he was already used to being called prince. At the same time, he was telling Mo Jingqi that if he, Mo Xiaoyao, wanted to become king, he didn't need anyone to confer him a title. Mo Xiaoyao's face was gloomy as he stared at his subordinates, causing their hearts to beat wildly. Ever since Wang Fei's accident, the prince's temper had become exceptionally unpredictable. Although he was still wise on important matters, his temperament was not as easy to get along with as before. Seeing his expression, everyone thought about it carefully and understood what the problem was. The prince and Wang Fei had been separated for a long time and naturally wanted to spend more time alone. It would be strange if the prince was happy that these people had come early in the morning to disturb his good dreams. They couldn't help but shoot resentful glances at Han Mingxi, who had just landed from the tree. The other half looked pleadingly at Yili, who was standing next to Mo Xiaoyao. Yili smiled slightly and secretly pulled Mo Xiaoyao's hand. Mo Xiaoyao snorted lightly and said, "Forget it, rise." "Thank you, Prince, Wang Fei." Everyone seemed to have been pardoned and hurriedly stood to give their thanks. After bowing, those who didn't have anything else to do hurriedly left. None of them were idiots. The prince didn't want to see them right now, so they had to be perceptive and make themselves disappear. Mo Xiaoyao looked with an unfriendly expression at the people who remained and said in a deep voice, "What do you want?" The leader, Feng Zhiyao, rubbed his nose helplessly. They really did have matters to attend to. Feng Zhiyao came forward and said, "Prince, the news of Wang Fei's safe return has already spread. There will probably be news from the court very soon. We need to quickly come up with a countermeasure. In addition, the officials have reported that the people of the city are preparing to hold a lantern festival to pray for Wang Fei and the little Shitzi in order to celebrate Wang Fei's safe return. Will Prince and Wang Fei attend at that time?" When the court was mentioned, Mo Xiaoyao's expression darkened even more. He snorted lightly and said, "Mo Jingqi isn't that fast. Don't worry about it for now. If they send someone here, just chase them out." Feng Zhiyao shrugged helplessly and didn't say anything else. Qin Feng came forward and said, "Prince, Wang Fei, where are the two people that were brought back yesterday?" When Tan Jiji was mentioned, Yili hurriedly asked, "Did you find the Lin Dafu that I asked you to find yesterday?" Qin Feng nodded and said, that Lin Dafu was slightly injured and was taken away by Tan Jiji through another route. They were probably planning on bringing him back to Jing. This morning, they arrived in Ruyang City. Does Wang Fei want to see them now? Yili thought for a moment and shook her head. She said, "Have people take good care of Lin Dafu. He has had a hard journey. We'll talk about it after he's rested." Qin Feng nodded, indicating that he would make the appropriate arrangements. He glanced at Mo Xiaoyao, who was standing to the side, and continued, "Tan Jiji wants to see Prince and Wang Fei." Yili naturally remembered why she had spared Tan Jiji's life yesterday. She raised her head to look at Mo Xiaoyao and clearly saw the displeasure on his face. He smiled helplessly at her and said to Qin Feng, "Later, I'll go see him with Prince." Mo Xiaoyao held Yili with one hand and swept his gaze over everyone's faces. "Are you done?" Zhuo Jing and Leng Haoyu, who had wanted to speak, tactfully swallowed the words at the tip of their tongues. The prince looked at them with a threatening gaze. It wasn't an urgent matter. Since the prince didn't want to hear it, then they wouldn't say it. Originally, they had come early in the morning just to confirm that Princess Ding had returned safely. The past few months hadn't been easy. They didn't want to face that kind of prince again. Watching everyone leave, Yili sighed softly. She didn't know Mo Xiaoyao's thoughts, but they were already in this kind of position. How could they really abandon everything? Pulling Mo Xiaoyao's hand, she walked back to the small courtyard. Yili laughed softly and said, "Go back and eat breakfast and rest. In the afternoon, can you play the guqin for me?" The gloominess in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes gradually dissipated. Looking at Yili, his eyes were full of warmth and affection. "Okay." Holding one of his arms, Yili smiled faintly. There would be a lot of things to do in the future. It didn't matter if she indulged a little after returning, right? In the afternoon, there was a faint coolness under the big tree in the governor's residence's backyard. Yili leaned on the beauty chair and leisurely flipped through a scroll. Mo Xiaoyao sat lazily beside her. He leaned against the chair and buried his head in Yili's side, closing his eyes to rest. Obviously, if Yili wasn't pregnant, he would probably sleep on Yili's lap. Yili didn't mind. She held a scroll in one hand and put the other hand on his back, gently patting him from time to time. Feng Zhiyao walked in and saw this warm and tranquil scene. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao's peaceful sleeping face, he suddenly regretted disturbing their peace. But he had no choice but to come in and report the situation. Yili also saw Feng Zhiyao's hesitant appearance at the door. She smiled faintly and nodded at him. "Feng-san, let's talk." Feng Zhiyao walked over. He carefully glanced at Mo Xiaoyao, who was leaning against Yili. He saw Mo Xiaoyao open his eyes and look at him. Just when Feng Zhiyao thought he was going to say something or chase him out, Mo Xiaoyao closed his eyes again. "Feng-san, what's the matter?" Seeing Feng Zhiyao look like he had seen a ghost, Yili smiled and put down the scroll. She picked up the fan at the side and gently fanned Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao seemed to be very satisfied with this. He gently rubbed against her leg and his entire body relaxed. Feng Zhiyao looked at Mo Xiaoyao, who had his eyes closed. He didn't know if he was asleep and said in a low voice, "Wang Fei, someone from the court has come." Chapter 407. Yili raised an eyebrow. Such a coincidence. She had just returned yesterday and Mo Jingqi's people had arrived today. This was too much of a coincidence. Feng Zhiyao nodded and said, "It really is a coincidence, but this subordinate has investigated. It shouldn't be related to Wang Fei. The other just came out of Fei Hong Pass yesterday. However, it should be related to the person we caught yesterday. Tan Jiji." Yili frowned in thought. Tan Jiji's courage isn't small. He wants Mo Jingqi to save him. Isn't he afraid that if his identity is exposed, the first person to kill him will be Mo Jingqi? Feng Zhiyao smiled and said, "He probably didn't think that his identity would be known by us." This subordinate guesses that the reason why Mo Jingqi's people are involved is because he has made two preparations. After all, the Northwest is in our hands. No matter how careful he is, it is possible that he will fall into our hands. If we don't know that his other identity is related to Wang Fei, and just catch Tan Jiji, in the end, it is possible that he will be returned to Mo Jingqi. Yili nodded, then that is to say, Mo Jingqi knows what Tan Jiji came to the Northwest to do. At least it is something that will benefit him. Feng Zhiyao raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "Will Tan Jiji tell Mo Jingqi that the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's mausoleum is in the northwest? Mo Jingqi wants the treasures in the Emperor Mausoleum." It was said that the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's mysterious Emperor Mausoleum was the most abundant and mysterious of all the Emperor's tombs. Even Feng Zhiyao didn't think that the Emperor Mausoleum that had been missing from the beginning would be in the northwest. Yili stopped fanning herself. How will he explain how he knows the secret of the Emperor Mausoleum? Then we'll have to ask Tan Jiji. Feng Zhiyao said with a smile. Yili thought for a moment. Tell Tan Jiji that I want the Biluo flower and the antidote to the poison in Prince's body. Also. Yili frowned and said, tell Qin Feng to interrogate Su Zuidi. She must know something important. It was just that Tan Jiji's identity was not enough for her to hold on for so long without confessing. More importantly, how did she and Tan Jiji get to know each other? This subordinate obeys. Then, were they sent by Mo Jingqi? Feng Zhiyao asked. Yili lowered her eyes and said faintly, leave it for now. We'll talk about it when Prince is free. Hearing this, Feng Zhiyao's mouth twitched as he looked at Mo Xiaoyao, who was sleeping peacefully on the chair. Prince was very free, okay? The workaholic prince was very bad, but the suddenly lazy prince was even worse. Thinking about how the study was already piled high with reports and files in just 2 days, Feng Zhiyao felt his vision darken. He could only hope that Prince's current situation would not last for too long. This subordinate will take his leave. In the governor's mansion's dungeon, Tan Jiji sat in a corner, expressionlessly looking at the dark dungeon. It had already been 3 days since he had been locked in this dungeon, but he had not seen Mo Xiaoyao or Yili. Only Feng Zhiyao would come to see him from time to time. His intentions were clear. He only wanted the whereabouts of the Biluo flower and the antidote to the poison in Mo Xiaoyao's body. Of course, Tan Jiji would not easily tell Feng Zhiyao. He did not believe that Mo Xiaoyao would let him go if he really told him. But at the same time, he also knew that the longer he stayed here, the more disadvantageous it would be for him. He had to leave here before that bitch Su Zuidi could not take it anymore and spilled everything, or kill her. Shu Manlin was locked in a room opposite Tan Jiji. Although it was only a few steps away, the two could only look at each other from afar. Shu Manlin, as the southern border's holy maiden, was also a noble woman who had not suffered much since she was young. When she first came in, she still had the strength to curse and scold, but after Feng Zhiyao starved her for 2 meals, she obediently stayed there. But from time to time, she would look at Tan Jiji and cry, which made Tan Jiji, who was already annoyed, even more annoyed. He simply did not bother with her. The two of them had nothing to say in the cell. Tan Jiji sat on the side, lost in thought and thinking of a plan. Shu Manlin sat opposite him, crying and complaining from time to time. The sound of footsteps came from outside the door. Tan Jiji's expression did not change, but his gaze quickly shot to the door. Under the crowd's escort, a pair of beautiful people walked in hand. Tan Jiji's gaze first fell on Yili's body. She had changed out of her plain and simple clothes, and was wearing a lilac-colored water-cloud satin embroidered with light-colored hibiscus flowers. In this hot summer, it showed a different kind of delicate and elegant. At the same time, it also made Tan Jiji secretly apprehensive of the Prince Ding mansion's hidden strength. Now, Mo Jingqi had already seized Mo Xiaoyao's title of nobility on the grounds of Mo Xiaoyao's treason. He had completely sealed off the entire northwest region and the Dechu state's economic exchanges. The Prince Ding mansion was in this remote northwest region, but they were still able to produce this year's newest water cloud satin, a specialty of the Nanzhao kingdom. It could be seen that they had huge financial resources and connections. It should be known that even in the imperial palace, there were only about 10 pieces of water cloud satin in a year. When the two countries started fighting last year, they were completely out of stock. Tan Jiji had never felt that Yili was very beautiful because he had seen too many stunning beauties. But at this time, he had to admit that Mo Xiuyao's eyes were very good. The beauty of the woman in front of him was not stunning, but it made people feel comfortable and at ease. There was also that calm and composed expression, and the hint of brightness and confidence hidden between the gentle brows. It suddenly made people feel that any beauty in the world was just mediocre in front of her. Humph. Mo Xiuyao gave a light snort. His gaze slowly swept across Tan Jiji, and a dangerous presence came from his body. Tan Jiji felt a chill in his heart. He hurriedly took away his gaze from Yili's body. He stood and smiled at the door as he said, "This official Tan Jiji greets the prince and Wang Fei." Mo Xiuyao raised an eyebrow and looked at him as he said, "Very good, your courage isn't bad." There were not many people that could still calmly come forward to bow at this time. Mo Xiuyao couldn't help but have a higher opinion of the man in front of him. But this still could not change his impending fate. Behind him, someone moved 2 cushioned chairs in front of the prison cell. Mo Xiuyao pulled Yili to sit down. Even in this dark and dirty prison cell, the two were still at ease as though there were hundreds of flowers blooming in front of them. Someone had sent tea as a gift, but the prison cell was clearly not a good place to drink tea. Mo Xiuyao frowned and took the teacup from Yili's hands and put it on the table to the side. Yili gave a faint smile and looked at Tan Jiji and Shu Manlin to ask, "Tan official, this consort and prince have been busy these past few days and have neglected the two of you. Please forgive us. Are the two of you well?" Tan Jiji grimaced and looked at Yili as he said, "Wang Fei is too polite. Tan Jiji is not as skilled as the other." Yili nodded and looked at him with a smile as she asked, "Then Tan official should know what Ben Fei wants." "What is Tan official's answer?" Tan Jiji smiled and said, "This one understands. Wang Fei wants the Bai Luo flower. Wang Fei must have spent a lot of effort in this past year. But this one advises Wang Fei not to waste time on that person surnamed Liang. He won't be able to find the Bai Luo flower." "Oh." Yili's brows furrowed slightly. She raised a hand to rub her forehead and asked, "Why should I believe Tan official? Or, even if what Tan official says is true, so what?" Tan Jiji said, "The Bai Luo flower is a sacred item of Nanjiang. Does Wang Fei really believe that the Nanzhao royal family would give such a treasure to a wealthy merchant of Dechu state for safekeeping? Everyone says that merchants value profit. Has the Nanzhao royal family not considered the possibility that he would take the treasure for himself?" Yili sighed and looked helplessly at Tan Jiji as she said, "Tan official, since you dare to use the Bai Luo flower to protect your own life, Ben Fei does not doubt that you do not know the whereabouts of the Bai Luo flower. So, there is no need for you to say so much. But, you should know that before you find the item, anything you say is useless." Tan Jiji's eyes flashed as he stared at Yili and said, "What happens after you find the item? Is Wang Fei trying to convince this one that the Prince Ding mansion will keep its word?" Chapter 408. Feng Zhiyao, who was standing behind them, glanced at him and said with a smile, "Tan Darren, what can you do if you don't believe me?" Tan Jiji was silent. Indeed, it had fallen into the hands of the Prince Ding mansion. What could he do if he didn't believe it? If he believed it, he might have a way out. If he didn't believe it, he would die. Normally, Tan Jiji wouldn't mind taking this gamble. But now, he didn't dare to gamble because he didn't have time. Once something happened, not to mention telling Mo Xiuyao the whereabouts of the blue sky flower, even if he personally brought the blue sky flower to Mo Xiuyao, it would be difficult to escape. Thinking of this, Tan Jiji shook his head and said, "I'm sorry. Wang Fei should know that even if you know the whereabouts of the blue sky flower, it can't be obtained overnight. But I still have things to do. I really can't stay here for long. Presumably, His Majesty's envoy has already arrived in Ruyang." Tan Jiji was very confident in his previous arrangements. As long as Mo Xiuyao hadn't openly said that he wanted to rebel against Chu, he still had to be wary of the envoy of the imperial court. Tan Jiji. Lin Yuan, are you reminding I of your other identity? Mo Xiuyao narrowed his eyes and asked. Even if he didn't like Mo Jingqi, it didn't mean that he would let go of a remnant of the previous dynasty. After all, it wasn't only Emperor Taizu who destroyed the previous dynasty. The ancestors of the Prince Ding mansion also took most of the credit. So they were natural enemies. Tan Jiji smiled helplessly. He had to wonder how many chances he had to walk out of Ruyang alive. After thinking for a moment, Tan Jiji said, Prince, whether it's Tan Jiji or Lin Yuan, at least we don't have a conflict of interest right now, right? Killing Tan Jiji won't do any good to the Northwest and the Prince Ding mansion's current situation. Also, Prince understands His Majesty. His Majesty will definitely make a big fuss about this and destroy the reputation of the Prince Ding mansion. Mo Xiuyao sneered disdainfully. Do you think I care about this? Tan Jiji was indifferent. He really couldn't tell that Mo Xiuyao cared about the reputation of the Ding King's palace. This was also the thing he couldn't figure out the most. As long as one wasn't a fool or a naturally fatuous ruler, anyone would know the importance of winning the hearts of the people. Even someone like Mo Jingqi, who clearly didn't care about the lives of the common people, was still very concerned about public opinion. But for the past half a year, no matter what Mo Jingqi said, the Northwest had not responded. It was as if they had tacitly agreed to all of Mo Jingqi's claims. Such a situation made Tan Jiji faintly uneasy. With this kind of reaction, if Mo Xiuyao wasn't so dispirited that he was ready to give up, then he was ready to stir up chaos in the world. They would have to fight sooner or later anyway. Rather than trying to defend themselves now and making others think that they were hypocrites in the future, it would be better to not say anything from the beginning. Tan Jiji took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He lowered his head and thought for a moment before saying, falling into the hands of the prince this time, this one has lost. Wang Fei has also been to the imperial mausoleum. The treasures inside can be considered this one's apology for offending Wang Fei. Adding on the whereabouts of the Bailuo flower in exchange for this one's life. What does the prince think? Mo Xiuyao's expression was indifferent. It was clear that he wasn't interested in this at all. The imperial mausoleum was in the northwest. If Mo Xiuyao was happy, he could send people to dig it up at any time. There really wasn't any need for Tan Jiji to give it as a gift. Tan Jiji hadn't expected to pass so easily. After thinking, he continued, this one will also give you 100,000 taels of gold, as well as all of the secret bases in the northwest and Jing. Can this be considered sincere? Yili looked at him with interest and said with a small smile, Official Tan is really willing to pay. Tan Jiji smiled helplessly and said, no matter what, nothing is more important than one's life. Without one's life, what use is there in keeping anything else? Princess Consort, I don't think I have neglected you in the past few days. My previous rudeness can be considered as human nature. Is the price this one has paid not enough? Yili nodded in agreement with his words. If he had only captured him to threaten the Mahist army, then this kind of price and compensation was not small. After all, he hadn't really succeeded in taking her away to threaten Mo Xiuyao. It was not an exaggeration to say that he had tried to steal a chicken only to end up losing the rice used to lure it. But for some reason, Yili felt that there was a secret on him that was even more important than his identity. Lowering her eyes to think, Yili asked, Official Tan, how do you know about the poison in the prince's body and the cure? Tan Jiji calmly met her eyes and said with a smile, this one has studied the prince's case in the imperial hospital. And Wang Fei should know that father's medical skills are not as good as those so-called divine doctors. This one has seen and heard since childhood, so naturally I have some experience. Yili calmly stared at him for a long time. So long that Tan Jiji thought that he had made a mistake that he shouldn't have. Then he heard Yili change the topic and ask, "Official Tan, how do you know Su Zuodi?" As expected, it was this whore. Even though he had known the reason for his identity being exposed, but when Yili mentioned it, Tan Jiji still wanted to skin Su Zuodi alive. He had calculated everything and hid by Mo Jingqi's side for 10 years without revealing any flaws. He had secretly thought that he was flawless, but he hadn't thought that he would fall into the hands of this whore. Tan Jiji couldn't help but feel regret. He shouldn't have underestimated Mo Xiaoyao and Han Mingyue. If he wanted to kill that whore, there should have been a way to avoid the two of them. But he had been too careful and had instead caused a huge problem today. Even though he had already torn Su Zuodi to pieces in his heart, Tan Jiji's face didn't reveal any flaws. He looked at Mo Xiaoyao with a faint smile and said, "Miss Su was the #1 beauty in Dechu State. I'm not the only one who had a relationship with her. Even the world-famous young master Mingyu also fell for Miss Su's pomegranate skirt. Young and frivolous. I've let Wang Fei see a joke." In the cell, everyone's expression became a little strange. Everyone present was a trusted aide of the Prince Ding mansion and naturally understood Su Zuodi's identity. Tan Jiji's words were blatantly telling Mo Xiaoyao that his former fiancé had made him a cuckold more than once. Mo Xiaoyao's expression was the same as usual. His handsome chin slightly raised as he looked at Tan Jiji and asked, "You want I to immediately kill Su Zuodi, right?" Tan Jiji's heart trembled as he secretly reminded himself that going too far was as bad as not going far enough. He smiled and said, "If it wasn't for her, the prince probably wouldn't know my identity right now, right? Who knew that a moment of carelessness in my early years would cause me to fall into such a situation? Naturally, I don't want Su Zuodi to live anymore." "What?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled indifferently and no longer paid attention to Tan Jiji. Tan Jiji secretly sighed in relief. He understood that his life and death was now in Yili's hands. But what Yili cared about the most was Mo Xiaoyao's life. "Young Master Tan, how will you make this consort believe that the whereabouts of the falling jade flower you provided is true?" Yili asked softly. Tan Jiji smiled proudly and said, "Because in this world, no one knows the true whereabouts of the falling jade flower except for me." Yili raised her eyebrows and said with a smile, "If that's the case, then this consort can't believe you. After all, you're not willing to stay until this consort obtains the falling jade flower. Isn't this making things difficult for me? So, Lord Tan can leave, but Miss Shu must stay." Everyone's gaze fell on Shu Manlin, who was in the other cell. Shu Manlin didn't say anything because she knew that she couldn't be of any help. But she didn't expect that in the end, she would be dragged into this. She couldn't help but stand up and pounce on the bars of the cell. She angrily glared at Yili and said, "Yili, you're impudent. I'm the southern border's holy maiden, how dare you imprison me?" Chapter 409. Yili raised her eyebrows but didn't speak. Feng Zhiyao, who was behind her, smiled in surprise. "Nanzhang's holy maiden. This young master has never seen Nanzhang's holy maiden. This time, it's all thanks to Wang Fei. But, speaking of which, it seems that Nanzhang's holy maiden can't see outsiders, much less leave Nanzhao's capital. Wang Fei, this isn't a fake, right?" Yili said with a smile, "It's the real deal." Shu Manlin's face paled. She was deeply favored by the king of Nanzhao. However, as Nanzhang's holy maiden, she had secretly run to Dechu State and let people see her appearance. This was an unforgivable crime in the eyes of Nanzhao's people. If this spread, she wouldn't be able to retire in Nanzhang's holy land. It would be good enough if she wasn't burned to death by Nanzhao's people. This was Nanzhao's rule for hundreds of years. Even the king of Nanzhao couldn't save her. Moreover, she had a political enemy, Princess Anxi, who was eyeing her covetously. If this spread to Princess Anshi's ears, she definitely wouldn't be able to escape. Tan Jiji couldn't help but frown at Yi Li's conditions. After a long time, he said, Wang Fei is truly intelligent. This one has no choice but to admit defeat. His identity had been exposed. This meant that his 10 years of business in the Chu capital had been destroyed. At least, he definitely couldn't go back to Mo Jingqi's side. As a result, Nan Zhao became his last bargaining chip. If he wanted to control Nan Zhao, he could only rely on Xu Manlin. Yi Li obviously saw through this, which was why she proposed the condition of detaining Xu Manlin. If something happened to Xu Manlin, even if he escaped the northwest, as long as the Prince Ding mansion did something, he would be hunted down by both the Chu capital and Nan Zhao. At that time, no matter how big the world was, there would be no place for him to hide. Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled. Official Tan is overpraising me. Mo Xiuyao stood and helped Yi Li up to leave. Yi Li smiled at Tan Jiji. Official Tan, you can think about it for one night. Tell me your answer tomorrow morning. Leave Xu Manlin behind. As long as this consort finds the Bai Luo flower, this matter will be written off. Tan Jiji smiled helplessly. Do I have a choice? If he could do it all over again, Tan Jiji swore that he would never care whether Yi Li was Princess Ding or not. After leaving that damned imperial mausoleum, he would immediately leave the northwest. The Prince Ding mansion was never a place where Lin Luoran could rest assured. After Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao left, the people in the cell immediately left, leaving Tan Jiji and Xu Manlin to face each other in silence. After a long time, Xu Manlin asked in a trembling voice, Jiji, you really want to leave me here? Tan Jiji sighed softly and looked at Xu Manlin with eyes full of tenderness and pity. Lin, you can see that we have no choice now. If we don't agree with them, we'll both die here. Don't worry, as long as Yi Li gets the Bai Luo flower, she will naturally let you go. Xu Manlin looked at him hesitantly. Are we really going to give them the Bai Luo flower? Tan Jiji said softly, no matter how precious the Bai Luo flower is, it's still a dead object. How can it be more important than you? As long as we're alive, we still have a chance. Don't you think so? How could Xu Manlin not know that they had no other choice? Even if she didn't agree to stay in the northwest, who would listen to her opinion? Although Tan Jiji was only saying sweet words, Xu Manlin still understood that Tan Jiji wouldn't abandon her. Since there was no other choice, she had to make Tan Jiji feel even more guilty towards her. She nodded with tears in her eyes and said, I understand. Jiji, I will stay in the northwest. You have to be careful. Tan Jiji looked at her with a gentle gaze and said softly, Lin, thank you. Jiji will not let you down. Xu Manlin nodded and said, we've known each other for so many years, I naturally believe you. Jiji, I'll wait for you. Although they were in this gloomy prison cell, the two of them looked at each other with eyes full of emotions and lingering feelings. It made the prison cell feel a little more warm, but what kind of thoughts and schemes were behind this touching and lingering feelings, was not something that outsiders could know. After leaving the prison, Mo Xiuyao and Yi Li walked side by side. Yi Li hesitantly raised her head and asked, is it good to let Tan Jiji go like this? Mo Xiuyao smiled faintly and said, what's so good about it? If Li is happy, let him go. If not, kill him. Yi Li helplessly glanced at him and said, killing someone isn't like cutting a radish, what's there to be happy about? Letting him go isn't a big deal. After all, the conditions he proposed are not bad, but I keep feeling that something is missing. Although the Prince Ding mansion had a large business, it was a foregone conclusion that they would break off relations with Mo Jingqi. The Prince Ding mansion's business was not completely without losses. 100,000 gold taels was not a lot, but it was not a small amount either. Adding on the influence that Tan Jiji had in the northwest and the capital, if it was only for the matter of Tan Jiji trying to catch her, this transaction was clearly worth it. Mo Xiaoyao copied Yi Li's usual attitude and shrugged. To him, killing someone and cutting a radish were not that big of a difference. If he's released, then let him go. If he's not obedient, then just catch him again. Yi Li smiled and said, "Does the prince think that Tan Jiji is easy to catch?" This time, if Tan Jiji wasn't unlucky enough to be found out by Mo Xiaoyao in the northwest, it wouldn't be that easy to catch him. For him to be able to hide by Mo Jingqi's side for so long without attracting anyone's attention, it was enough to show this person's ability. Mo Xiaoyao was indifferent. There's no one that I can't kill if I want to kill them. Even if they are fine now, there will be a day when they will die. Reaching out to hold Mo Xiaoyao's hand, the two of them strolled along the corridor. This time, Mo Xiaoyao had really changed a lot. Yi Li couldn't tell if this change was good or bad. In the past, Mo Xiaoyao was too deep. Even Yi Li sometimes couldn't completely see through him. Sometimes, Yi Li even felt that what she saw was what Mo Xiaoyao wanted her to see. But the current Mo Xiaoyao was more casual and fearless. Of course, there was also a strange stubbornness. For example, he didn't like Han Mingxi, so every time he saw Han Mingxi, he would release his killing intent without hesitation. Sometimes, Yi Li would even worry that Mo Xiaoyao would one day kill Han Mingxi behind her back. Yi Li had also talked to Mo Xiaoyao about this when he was in a good mood. At the time, Mo Xiaoyao looked at her seriously and said that if Yi Li was unhappy, he wouldn't kill him. Yi Li believed Mo Xiaoyao's promise, but she didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he turned around and released his killing intent towards Han Mingxi. Now, whenever Han Mingxi saw Mo Xiaoyao, he didn't provoke him and just walked around him. And now, since Mo Xiaoyao remembered that he wanted to kill Tan Jiji, Yi Li felt that even if Tan Jiji was released, he would have a headache in the future. Prince, Wang Fei. Qin Feng appeared at the end of the corridor and bowed to the two. Yi Li nodded and asked with a smile, "Is there any news from Su Zuodi?" Qin Feng frowned in defeat and said with a green face, "This subordinate is useless. Su Zuodi isn't willing to say anything other than Tan Jiji's identity." Qin Feng felt that it was a mistake for him to underestimate Su Zuodi in the past. In all these years, he had never seen a woman who could endure torture so well. Especially when this woman was a delicate woman who would cry if she pricked her finger with a needle. Chapter 410. It's fine, it's expected. Take it slow, there's no need to rush. Be careful not to kill her. Yi Li said. If Su Zuodi was really as weak as she appeared, she wouldn't have the guts to seduce Han Mingyue and betray Mo Xiaoyao. Then she dumped Han Mingyue and hooked up with the Emperor of Xiling and Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling. For a woman from a prestigious family who had never left the Chu capital to have such schemes and methods, it was amazing. So if she had some other skills, Yi Li wouldn't be surprised at all. But Yi Li didn't want to kill her just like that. She could feel that for Su Zuodi to be so stubborn and unwilling to confess, it was definitely an earth-shattering secret. This subordinate obeys. Qin Feng lowered his head and accepted the order. Mo Xiaoyao looked down at Yi Li, who was deep in thought, and said softly, "Yi Li can't be too tired now, what's the point of thinking so much?" Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "It's nothing, I just feel that there's something wrong with Su Zuodi." It was true that Su Zuodi was a woman who could endure, but she definitely wasn't a woman who was born to endure hardships, unless she said that the situation in the future would be worse than now. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows, thought for a moment and said to Qin Feng, "Secretly spread the news, say. I found Elder Su's granddaughter, Su Zuodi." Qin Feng was startled, looked at Mo Xiaoyao with some confusion and said, "Prince." Mo Xiaoyao played with the hair on Yi Li's shoulder and said carelessly, "There's no need to do too much, just let the people who should know. Understand?" Qin Feng understood, "This subordinate understands, I'll do it immediately." Early the next morning, Mo Xiaoyao and Yili didn't have to ask as Tan Jiji asked the guard in charge of the dungeon to bring a message. He completely agreed to all of Yili's conditions. As long as Yili could guarantee Shu Manlin's safety, he agreed to temporarily hold her hostage in Ruyang City until Yili found the Bailuo flower. In response, Yili and Mo Xiaoyao were not surprised at all. Tan Jiji's life was on the line. No matter what he had to exchange for it, it was obvious that Tan Jiji had profited. After all, if he lost his life, those things would just be a pile of trash. Tan Jiji was not an indecisive person. He was also very forthright when he paid the bill. With his official seal, the Shadow Guard received 100,000 taels of gold from Tan Jiji's hidden forces in the northwest on the same day. At the same time, this also proved that Tan Jiji's hidden forces were shocking enough. Mo Xiaoyao's mood wasn't too bad during this time, so he didn't plan on going back on his word. Immediately, he ordered Tan Jiji to be released from the prison cell. Tan Jiji was in a hurry to leave the northwest, so he bluntly declined Feng Zhiyao's invitation to stay until the next day. He expressed that he would set off immediately. Yili also didn't keep him. There was only one last thing, the whereabouts of the Bailuo flower. Tan Jiji looked at Yili, a trace of an evil smile on his face. Wang Fei, you've been looking for the Bailuo flower from all over the world, but the real Bailuo flower has always been right under your nose. Yili frowned and thought for a moment. The Bailuo flower is in the Chu capital. Tan Jiji smiled proudly, saying, that's right, the Bailuo flower is in the Chu capital. And it's in the Chu palace. It's in Mo Jingqi's hands. Why is it in Mo Jingqi's hands? Yili asked with a frown. It was impossible for Mo Jingqi not to know that the Bailuo flower could cure Mo Xiaoyao's body. If he obtained it, wouldn't he destroy it? Tan Jiji seemed to see her worry and said with a smile, Wang Fei, don't worry. The Bailuo flower is known to be able to revive the dead. Mo Jingqi cherishes his life so much, he definitely wouldn't destroy it. He would only carefully hide it in a place no one would think of. To be honest, ever since the Bailuo flower was in his hands, even this one couldn't guess where he hid it. Yili coldly swept a glance at him and asked, you were the one who gave the Bailuo flower to Mo Jingqi? Tan Jiji didn't deny it and said with a self-satisfied smile, Wang Fei, don't you think this is a good idea? In reality, I originally didn't want to give it to Mo Jingqi, but ever since I found out that Wang Fei and the sickly scholar of the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce were looking for it, I had no choice but to do this. With the Prince Ding Mansion and the Yanwang Chamber of Commerce's methods, they will find out sooner or later that the Bailuo flower isn't in the hands of the surnamed Liang. Then, I might be in trouble. But who would think that such a treasure would be in the hands of the Dechu State's emperor? The thing that Prince Ding needs the most is in the hands of the person who hates him the most. Haha. You can leave. Since this consort agreed to your conditions, I won't go back on my word. However, you should pray that you won't fall into this consort's hands next time. Yili said lightly. Tan Jiji put away the deliberate smile on his face and swept a malicious glance at Yili, saying, this one will definitely remember Wang Fei's words. I definitely won't let myself fall into the hands of the Prince Ding Mansion again. Goodbye. Yili turned to leave. I won't see you out. After sending off Tan Jiji, Mo Xiaoyao immediately turned hostile and unceremoniously threw out the envoy sent by Mo Jingqi out of Ruyang City. As for the issue of them coming to ask for someone, all the men, women, and children in Ruyang City saw Tan Jiji leave the city gate. He was unwilling to return to Chujing and did not care about the Mo family army and Prince Ding's Fu. As for Tan Jiji's identity, Mo Xiaoyao didn't plan on telling Mo Jingqi, but he didn't deliberately hide it either. Whether or not Mo Jingqi had the ability to know was none of his business. In the room, Mo Xiaoyao, who had just finished washing up, looked at the white-haired man in the bronze mirror with disgust. His white hair was still damp. Then, his gaze fell on a small black porcelain bottle on the side. It was the hair dye solution that Shin Yang had specially made for him. In the past, Mo Xiaoyao didn't think that he was a person who cared about his appearance, but now, every time he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he found it more and more unbearable. His head of snow-white hair and the hideous scar on the left side of his face made his originally pale face even more strange and terrifying. He didn't want Yili to see his frightening appearance. He wasn't afraid of scaring her, but he didn't want her to see his ugly appearance. His Yili was so perfect, but A trace of hatred flashed through his gloomy eyes. He was so broken and ugly. Only now did Mo Xiaoyao realize that it wasn't because he didn't care about his appearance in the past. It was because when he was 17 or 18 years old, he already had a unique appearance. He didn't need to be envious of anyone. But after 17 years old, there was no one who made him feel like he needed to care about his appearance. He could even imagine, if he stood next to Yili now, what a strange scene it would be. Pa! A palm slammed on the table in front of him. The red sandalwood table groaned in pain, and a few cracks quickly spread across the surface of the table. Xiaoyao. Yili's voice sounded from outside the door. Mo Xiaoyao's body stiffened. If he didn't know who was outside, he was afraid that he would have sent that person flying with a slap. He only felt like hiding, but there was no place in the room suitable for a tall man like him to hide. Moreover, Yili obviously knew that he was in the room, so how could he really hide? Yili slowly walked in, turned around the screen and looked at the white-haired man sitting in front of the bronze mirror. As if she didn't notice Mo Xiaoyao's stiffening, she walked over and picked up a towel to gently wipe his hair. Why is your hair still wet? Although the weather is quite hot, be careful of a headache. Chapter 411. Li Li. Mo Xiaoyao turned around and stared blankly at the woman with a gentle smile in front of him. After coming back and recuperating for a few days, Yi Li's complexion was clearly much better. Although she was not as round as many women who were 7 or 8 months pregnant, she still looked very healthy and beautiful. As Yi Li wiped his hair, she asked softly, "What's wrong?" Mo Xiaoyao shook his head. "It's nothing." Yi Li smiled faintly and said, "It's good that you're fine. I'll help you fix your hair." The room was quiet as Yi Li gently dried his hair. Then, her fingers deftly tied up his snow-white hair. She took a silver ribbon from the box at the side and tied it properly. Only then did she look at it with satisfaction and nodded, "Very good." Mo Xiaoyao pulled Yi Li into his embrace and pressed his face against her round belly. He listened to the baby's vigorous movements in her belly, occasionally being kicked. "Li Li, if I become so ugly, won't you dislike me?" Yi Li stared blankly and couldn't help but smile. But seeing the person in front of her so carefully, her eyes couldn't help but ache and she almost cried. Gently stroking Mo Xiaoyao's silver hair, Yi Li asked softly, "If I become ugly, will you dislike me?" "Of course not. Li Li will always be the most beautiful," Mo Xiaoyao said solemnly. Yi Li smiled and said, "Then that's it. Besides, you've never been good-looking." How could Yi Li not have seen many good-looking men? There was Su Qingchen who was as refined as an immortal, the cultured and refined Ming Yu Gongzi who was as bright as the moon in the sky, the extraordinarily handsome Han Mingxi who seemed unruly but was actually pure and sincere, and the famous handsome men in the capital, Feng Zhiyao and Leng Haoyu. In comparison, no matter how outstanding Mo Xiaoyao's looks were, it couldn't change the fact that half of his face was disfigured. So, in Yi Li's eyes, Mo Xiaoyao really wasn't considered a pretty boy. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao's stunned expression, Yi Li smiled and said, "But since you're aware that you're ugly, why don't you let Mr. Shen and Master take a look at the wound on your face?" Mo Xiaoyao hesitated. The injuries on his face were not untreatable. Instead, it was because Mo Xiaoyao, who had been seriously injured by the virus and was in pain every day, did not want to care about the scars on his face. Even his healthy body and legs were gone. What difference did it make if his face was ruined? Moreover, there were several times when Xinyang thought that he couldn't save Mo Xiuyao. Naturally, he didn't have the energy to pester him to deal with the problem on his face. When Mo Xiuyao's condition stabilized, Xinyang thought of this matter. However, he was rejected by the gloomy Mo Xiuyao without hesitation. He reached out to touch the scars on his face. It's already been so many years. Yili smiled and said, "What's the harm in trying? I heard that a certain person's face didn't have any scars at all. It healed naturally. It's really amazing. Since it's like this, why is Prince suddenly worried about his appearance today?" Being teased by Yili like this, Mo Xiuyao actually felt a lot more relaxed. Hugging her waist and locking her in his embrace, Mo Xiuyao sullenly said, "Even if Lili dislikes me, it's too late. If anyone dares to fight with me, I'll cut them into pieces." Yili helplessly patted him and said, "You're becoming more and more like a child. Do you think I'm a gold ingot that everyone wants?" Mo Xiuyao lightly snorted. His Lili was much more precious than a gold ingot. However, she could only be his. Anyone who coveted his treasure would all die. "Master, how have you been these past few days?" Yili pulled Mo Xiuyao into the small courtyard where Dr. Lin was temporarily staying. She looked at Dr. Lin, who was sitting under a big tree in the courtyard and drinking tea alone. Dr. Lin turned around to look at her. His gaze fell on Mo Xiuyao, who was standing next to her with an unkind look in his eyes. Before, Dr. Lin had seen Mo Xiuyao from afar. However, at that time, Mo Xiuyao's hair was completely black. He didn't look as shocking as he did now. Looking at Yili, Dr. Lin nodded and said, "Sit." Yili didn't stand on ceremony. After thanking Dr. Lin, she pulled Mo Xiuyao to sit down. She picked up the teacup on the table and poured a cup for herself and Mo Xiuyao. She smiled and said, "There have been a lot of things these past few days. I haven't had the time to visit Master. I hope Master will forgive me." Dr. Lin lightly snorted. They hadn't formally taken in a disciple before. All he did was give Yili some pointers. Yili had always called him Master. In reality, the two of them didn't take it to heart. In the end, it was more of a safety issue. So Dr. Lin naturally didn't have any opinions about Yili. In fact, after the matter with Tan Jiji, Yili had already repaid his debt of saving her life. He was once poisoned by cold poison. Dr. Lin sized up Mo Xiuyao. He frowned and asked, "Why is there cold and fire poison in his body now?" Cold poison and fire poison naturally couldn't coexist. Normally, it was possible to fight poison with poison. However, the two poisons in Mo Xiuyao's body maintained a delicate balance. However, this didn't mean that Mo Xiuyao was better off. In fact, the side effect of two poisons existing at the same time was that the body had to endure double the pain. Mo Xiuyao raised his eyebrows. He didn't expect the old man in front of him to have some ability. Although he didn't have a good impression of the old man, he still remembered that he had saved Li and the child in her belly. He didn't hide it and said indifferently, "I used phoenix tail grass before." Dr. Lin sized up Mo Xiuyao for a long time. Finally, he said, "Prince Dinghua is indeed different from ordinary people. At the very least, your endurance is enough to look down on the world. I would like to see the doctor from before." With Dr. Lin's medical skills, it was impossible for him not to see that Mo Xiuyao had some problems before. When a brilliant doctor met someone as brilliant as himself, he couldn't help but want to discuss and compare notes. Yili looked at Dr. Lin with some expectation. She asked, "Master, do you have any methods to cure the poison in Mo Xiuyao's body?" Dr. Lin sneered and said, "If it was just cold poison, I could think of a way. But now, there's no need to think of anything. No matter which poison was detoxified first, the other poison would immediately take his life. These two poisons are also incompatible. At least until now, this old man hasn't thought of a way to make them compatible without damaging their medicinal properties. Yili originally didn't have much hope, so she wasn't disappointed. She only asked, "What if there's a blue falling flower?" Blue falling flower? Dr. Lin frowned. He put down his teacup and looked at Yili. After thinking for a moment, he said, "Blue falling flower. If there really is a blue falling flower, it's not a bad idea. I seem to have read in an ancient book that a pill made from blue falling flower can cure 100 poisons and revive the dead. Actually, it's more accurate to say that it can cure 100 poisons. It's completely different from the so-called antidote we're researching. It can be said that it's just relying on the blue falling flower's powerful medicinal properties to forcibly remove any poison in the body. It's just that the blue falling flower has been extinct for many years, so I haven't seriously researched the prescription." Yili was overjoyed. Although he hadn't obtained the blue falling flower, Shen Yang had actually been researching the prescription for a long time. However, because it was an ancient prescription that had been lost, it took a lot of effort to research it. Sickly Scholar knew the prescription, but Yili couldn't be at ease taking something from him. You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.